90 minutes, 5 minutes, or 1 minute. So, all right.
Awesome. Thanks. Hey, I'm Maulik from Tufts. This is joint work with my excellent co-authors, Steve and Nancy. High returns and low adoption, air purifiers in Bangladeshi firms. Thanks to the organizers by including this paper on the program. So air pollution represents a paradox of modern economic development. On the one hand, it's an inevitable byproduct of conventional economic transformation. On the other hand, it undermines the very economic growth in our companies. And this tension is nowhere more acute than in South Asia, which has seen both rapid increases in air pollution levels, as at the same time as seen rapid economic growth. Traditional regulatory responses in these regions, which are mostly command and control policies, have proven insufficient despite being very ambitious. And this region has been projected to face decades of dangerously elevated air pollution levels. So in this context, workplace air purifiers, which can filter indoor air despite severe outdoor air quality, may be critical to sustain productivity. However, we have no causal evidence on either the returns of purifiers for firms or the barriers preventing their adoption. So what this paper does is address this gap by 2 field experiments with micro enterprises in Bangladesh, ready-made garment manufacturing sector. This is an ideal context to answer these questions for 3 reasons. 1, air pollution levels in Bangladesh regularly exceed the WHO guidelines by as much as 15-fold. And the estimates that air pollution causes or hits Bangladesh's GDP by 4%. Second, micro enterprises in Bangladesh account for 97% of all non-farm economic units. This is typical of other developing countries as well. And third, the ready-made manufacturing sector is responsible for 4 million workers in Bangladesh and contributes around 10% of its GDP. So in the first RCT is a year-long study to estimate productivity and profit returns. We work with 124 micro enterprises in this sector. There are few unique features about the RMG manufacturing sector of Bangladesh. First, orders dictate production. So production is highly order dependent. And it's typically highest before Eid in February, March. Second, once firms get an order, they hire workers. So it's a task-based hiring. And once the task is done, the workers switch. They get switched to another job or another firm. And this means that workers are paid a piece rate and earnings are highly seasonal. To preview the research design, it's very simple. A random set of firms out of the 124 were installed with an air purifier with smart plugs. The smart plugs tell us exactly when the air purifiers were being used at no cost in randomly selected subset of firms. This is an expensive piece of equipment. It costs around $600 USD. So these are like small residential air purifiers. These are like 12 units. And it's expensive for the micro enterprise as well. It's 1 month of their average profit. The electricity costs, however, are trivial. They're as much as that of a city. Both the treatment and control firms were installed with an air quality monitor. This records like hourly indoor air pollution levels or PM2.5 levels. So we have quite a bit of data. We have minute-by-minute air purifier usage from the smart plugs. We have hourly PM2.5 readings for both indoor as well as outdoor air pollution. And then we have daily worker level output. This is from the records that these firms maintain because they pay a piece rate. They maintain every day which worker produced how many units and what money they were paid for a product. And then we conducted monthly revenue and cost surveys with the owners every month. Okay. We have the daily worker level data and the monthly revenue and cost data for the pre-period as well. So the installation or the intervention began on the 1st of April, 2023. So we have 2 months of pre-period data. This is also the highest production months of February and March. And then our intervention period from April 23 to March 24. So to preview the results, average outdoor levels in 23-24 pretty high. They were even higher than what's typical. It was around, the PM2.5 levels were on average 110 micrograms per cubic meters, which is 22 times higher than the WHO's safe limit. The average indoor levels were 75 micrograms per cubic meter, which is 15 times the WHO's annual safe limit of 15 micrograms. Treatment firms use the air purifier extensively. The median firm used it on an average day for 4 to 6 hours. So quite extensive usage. And interestingly, firm owners increased the use of air purifiers in response to higher pollution levels. So they could see on the monitor what the pollution levels are like, and presumably they increase their use, especially during peaks of PM 2.5, peaks of air pollution. All of this meant that average hourly indoor PM 2.5 levels were lower in the treatment firms than the control firms over the course of this 1 year period by around 15%, or 12 micrograms per cubic meters. Estimates can be as high as 40 micrograms per cubic meters in high pollution months. The correlation between month-by-month estimates of the treatment control differences and the monthly indoor PM 2.5 levels in the control firms is pretty high. It's 0.95, which is consistent with owners increasing the air purifier use in response to higher PM 2.5. What this means in terms of productivity is that treatment firms saw a 10% increase in the average daily worker output compared to control firms. There was no change in labor supply. Estimates can be as high as 22% in the high production months, so this is February and March. The correlation for the month-by-month productivity estimates and the monthly PM 2.5 estimates I just talked about, it's pretty high, it's 0.44, but it's what's higher is the correlation between the month-by-month productivity estimates and the monthly production costs in the control firms, which is a proxy for how much production is happening in the market. It's around 0.89. This sort of patterns are consistent with the profit data as well. So the treatment firms observe an 18% increase in profits relative to control firms over the course of this 1 year period. Again, the profit impacts are also highest in February and March. And then you see the same pattern in terms of correlation. The correlation between month-by-month profit estimates and monthly production in the control firms is 0.56. And the month-by-month profit estimates and the month-by-month labor productivity estimates, the correlation is 0.7. So overall, this is just to say that production slack basically moderates the purifier's returns. When production is high, when workers are working faster and production is high, owners can line up more orders and translate to higher output for the workers and higher returns for the firms. Okay, when the production is low, the faster pace the workers are working with cannot be translated into more orders, so output doesn't rise by as much, and neither does the returns. Which means that the treatment firms strategically shut down early in the low production months and stay open longer in the high production months. And I'll show you those results. Overall, all of this means is that owners would recover the purifier's costs in around 3 high production months, or less than 3 high production. So the return period for this purifier is really great. Okay. So given this, we were surprised that not every firm already has a purifier. So what we did to figure out, we wanted to figure out what the barriers to purifier adoption were amongst firms. So we ran a second RCT. This was with 2,500 micro enterprises in the same RMG manufacturing sector. This was done during the peak production periods of January and March 2024. Actually, that's a typo, 2025, not 2024. Fewer than 10 firms own any air purifiers in this amongst the 2,500 micro enterprises. The willingness to pay for the control firms who didn't get any intervention, which I'll talk about in a minute, was around 12% of retail price. So the willingness to pay for an air purifier is really low. And there's significant uncertainty and heterogeneity in the expected returns for the purifier. So we asked owners how much returns they expected from purifiers. 20% were uncertain about what they said, don't know, we don't know. 20% expected no profit gains, and 5% couldn't quantify. They expected a profit gain, but didn't know by how much. Of the 55% who expected specific increases, most predicted increase in profit of only 5 to 10%, which is below the 18% we estimate. Crucially, when we asked owners who said there will be no profit increases, we asked them why did they think that? A vast majority said that, profits depend on orders, and just because the workers are working fast, that would not translate to increased profits. Okay, and then they underestimated peak period returns. Okay, so given this, we wanted to figure out what the interventions were, what were the barriers were. So we had 5 interventions. The first was a generalized sort of information from the first experiment, where we told them what the returns were. That one group, one treatment, one arm got this information. Another arm, we were wondering if credit constraints were a barrier to adoption. So we told them that they have access to 12-month loans at 1% monthly interest rate. A third treatment arm where it might be that they're worried about the purifier breaking down, or they're worried about having to replace the filters and the costs associated with that. So we had a treatment arm where we told them you have free 2-year full service warranty with part replacement. You don't have to worry about that. And then maybe what they want to know is like the returns to their specific firm with their specific production process and the orders that they get. So we told them that they have access to a month-long money-back guarantee where they can test the product during the high peak production period of February, March 2025. And if they don't like the product, they can return it and get their money back. But there's still some counterparty risk involved with that. They have to trust that they'll get their money back. So we took away that in the final treatment arm. We told them you don't even have to pay upfront. You can test it during the peak production period for a month. If you don't like it, if you want to keep it, then you pay. If you don't like it, you just return. Okay, that was the final intervention. Yes, question and then.
So I'm just wondering about the distinction here between the uncertainty and the heterogeneity, and in particular, whether the heterogeneity in expected returns correlates with something that you can see is borne out in real heterogeneity in the experiment. Is it something where the returns are heterogeneous along characteristics that they are?
That's a good question. We haven't looked at the correlates of the heterogeneity with like some baseline observables of these firms.
I mean, presumably it's possible if it's a firm that has to keep the windows open or something that doesn't work so well.
Yeah, no, so about the windows, all the firms have their windows open, essentially, because it gets like,
maybe that's a bad example.
No, but still, that's a good idea. We can look into that. Yeah, thanks.
I was thinking like, you touched on this a little bit, but like uncertainty, it's uncertainty of maintenance costs as well. And sure, you offer them a year, but after that year, then they're still on the hook.
Yeah, so I'll talk about like, you'll see that a couple of these interventions worked to increase the willingness to pay, but don't take them to adoption. So it might be that they're worried about like structural uncertainties, and I'll talk about that as one of the potential reasons why adoption is. Yes.
Does the production process itself affect air pollution? Or imagine these are sewing machines dedicated to, can you say something?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't think so. You'll see that indoor pollution levels are always lower than outdoor air pollution levels. Okay, so what do we find? We find that relaxing information constraints alone does not increase willingness to pay. Credit constraints, even with information, had no effect on demand. Product durability concerns, so this sort of free 2-year full service warranty with part replacement also does not increase willingness to pay. It's not first order. What did increase willingness to pay were these purchase contracts, both the money back and the free trial, that enable sort of low risk experiential learning during the peak production periods. However, the resulting willingness to pay still remained way below the retail price. So although both the money back guarantee and free trial increased willingness to pay around 20 to 30%, it was nowhere close to taking them to adoption. Then we went back to the first experiment, the firms in the first experiment 1 year after. So the first experiment, we took back the purifiers in April 2024, and then in March 2025, we went back to them and we told them, hey, this is the same purifier you had. Would you like to buy this? Right? And turns out the treatment firm's willingness to pay was 81% higher than the control firm's willingness to pay, but again, off a low base. So it's still only 23% of retail price. It doesn't take you to adoption, even this experience with this product for like 1 year. All right, so given that, let me just tell you what air pollution levels are like during our intervention period. So what you see here are 3 lines, one from the US Embassy monitors for outdoor air pollution, and then 2 outdoor monitors that we installed in around August 2023. So before August 2023, you only see 1 line, because we're only using US Embassy data, and then you see 3 lines, but all 3 track pretty closely. This is outdoor air pollution levels or outdoor PM 2.5 levels on the y-axis, and pollution levels are really, really high, especially in the months of November, December, all the way through April. Regularly reaching 200 micrograms per cubic meter, is way higher than the WHO recommends is safe, which is 15 micrograms per cubic meter. I don't need to tell this room about this extensive literature in both public health and economics, talking about air pollution impacts on both productivity, health. I'm sure Jeanne will talk about it in the following presentation, so I'll leave this to her. What I want to spend a minute on is the literature on air purifiers and its efficacy in residential settings. So there is a extensive literature and epi literature that has tested air purifiers. These are efficacy trials. So these are experiments, but these are efficacy trials where the researcher controls the use of air purifiers in a room where the subjects are for maybe like a 2-day period, a 1-month period. or like heavily incentivizes use. And in those sort of efficacy, but not real world trials, they find that air purifiers decrease indoor PM 2.5 levels by over 50%, and they register improvements in objective and self-reported measures of health, okay? Crucially, one experiment in China found that these health improvements can manifest in as little as 48 hours of consistent use, okay? However, we know very little about real world effectiveness. So we have a complementary paper where we show that with households in Dhaka, purifier use is just too modest to get at like health improvement. So even households who barely use it, which is very different from firms as well. Yes.
Do you have data on whether the managers with the willingness to pay, they have it in their homes?
In the second experiment, we might, and not very many have. Yeah. Okay, so production in our context. I have 15 minutes, I'll rush through this. Typical production floor measures around 500 square feet, so not very large. These are micro enterprises. They have one door and 3 windows, which are always kept open for ventilation. Okay, electricity supply. So all of these things, electricity supply as well as ventilation, would reduce the efficacy of air purifiers. So electricity supply is very erratic, around 6 power cuts per week with an average duration of 40 minutes. Typical firm employs 10 workers, 80% male, 20% female. They're open for 250 days, typically in a year. Standard work week is 6 days, Fridays are off. Typical firm opens for 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., but almost all firms, they have workers working between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. Take 2 breaks, totaling around 120 minutes. Production range is diverse. They make t-shirts, underwear, shirts, 1 pieces, 2 pieces, pants, burqas. 7 out of 10 workers are operators focused on sewing. They're paid a piece rate, as I said, which varies based on what the piece is. If the piece is, you're making a shirt, the piece rate will be different than you're making a burqa. And even within a shirt, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the piece rate, depending on what you're doing. If you're doing a hem stitch, the piece rate is different. If you're doing a side stitch, the piece rate is different, right? Depends on how the piece you're working on. And essentially, the piece rate is highly correlated with the time it takes for you to complete that piece, right? If it's an entire t-shirt, the piece rate will be high. If it's just a hem stitch, the piece rate will be low. Firms employ individual production methods, not line production, which are common in like large garment factories. So each worker is independently responsible for what their task. If it's making an entire t-shirt, that's their task. If it's just a hem stitch or a side stitch, then that's their task. And they don't follow a fixed sequence like they do in line production methods. Upon completing their task, they can leave or move to another firm. And then typically operators work in the same firm. We can see the data based on names, only 45 days per year. They also employ 2 helpers and 1 cutting or pattern master. These are paid a fixed weekly or monthly salaries, unlike the operators who move around a lot. We will be looking at productivity just for the operators, okay? Because we know the piece rate and we know the outputs they're generating. Few workers have a manager, but like managerial responsibilities are handled by the owner. Typically, and as I said, orders dictate production for most firms. So on-demand manufacturing, heavily influenced by seasonal demand before February and March, and macroeconomic conditions, which means operators' earnings are also very seasonal. And then the nice thing for us, obviously, there's the data is here. They maintain like extensive records, every daily records, which they send us WhatsApp photographs of every day of like the worker name, what their worked on in that day, and like how much pieces they produced, what their total income, wage was. So all of that information. Rejection rates are very low, less than 2%. Okay, so this is a picture of one of our micro enterprises, the treatment firm. You can see the smart air, the tall $600 piece of equipment that we installed at the treatment firm for 1 year. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of product, across product variation, output per worker per day. So as I said, like piece rates are determined by how long it takes for you to produce a product, a piece. So, so products that are don't take long, so like an underwear, the piece rate is lower. Products that take a long time to produce, like a burqa or a 2-piece, the piece rates are far higher. And you see this, this variation also within a product, as I said, depending on what you're working on. Within a t-shirt, if you're not making the entire t-shirt, you're responsible for only a sleeve joint, your piece rate is only 0.8 taka. So there's a within t-shirt heterogeneity, because depending on what task you're doing. And there might be like different types of t-shirt might take more time, so the piece rate will be high. All right, so this is coming from the survey of 2,500 owners in experiment 2. We asked them in a typical year, which are the high and low production months. February and March, 65% owners said that February and March are the highest production months in a typical year. The next highest were January and April. When we asked them the reason for the seasonality, only 20% said no seasonality. Of the ones who said there was seasonality, mostly like orders or demand high, which is basically saying the same thing. Okay, this is the seasonality data coming from actual production cost data from the control firms for just the 1 year, 23-24. You see the same pattern. Production is highest in proxied by monthly production costs for the control firms. It's highest in March, February, and also pretty high in January and April. Pretty similar from experiment. Okay.
Yes, because you've already told us the entire paper, we're all eager to find out why.
Yes. So let me just the research design I don't need to spend time on since, as Mushfiq said, I told you about it. This is the Dhaka where we did the experiment. Narayanganj and Kamrangichar is where our firms were, and then you can see the USMC. Okay, so this is the monitors. I'll walk through the monitor we installed, records both humidity and temperature as well. And it's small screen so owners can see what's going on with the PM levels. This is the air purifier we installed. As I 600 USD. Electricity costs are trivial. We told them that we would pay them monthly electricity costs for running the purifier for 24 hours, but this was unconditional. So they're still facing the full marginal cost of running, right? Even if they didn't use the purifier, they'll still get this money. We just wanted to make sure that they are not concerned that electricity costs would be brutal. So we told them like, you'll get this unconditional, but they still face the full marginal cost. This is all to say that this experiment was very light touch. All we did was install the purifier and we left. We never monitored if this was plugged on or plugged off. We didn't force them to use the purifier. There was no other incentives. Okay. And smart plug was not glued on with the purifier. So we'll give you a lower bound. They might have used the purifier without the smart plug.
But where did you procure these from? And is it easy for them to procure it?
So it's available in the market if they want to buy it, but there's no domestic production. So the retailers who sell this, they import it from China.
What is this smart plug do?
The smart plug records when and they're using the purifier. So we have use data, minute by minute use data.
And you were providing the
This is smart.
electricity subsidy for the full duration of the experiment, as in
Correct.
perhaps they understood that you were paying for electricity or something. You don't have any variation in that.
No. So yeah, we told them that every month you'll get this money irrespective of whether you use the purifier.
Oh, so when you say they, right? So is it a manager who's making a decision, but there's a separate owner? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the firm owner is usually responsible to this is the manager, essentially. If the firm owner is not there, they delegate that responsibility to some family member. So there's no dedicated manager on the factory. If the owner is there, they're making.
So is the decision maker the residual claimant of extra productivity?
The decision maker. So yes, they are the returns, they are incurring the returns, correct.
So is the air purifier a substitute for the fan?
Yeah, so it doesn't.
Because it's usually not treated as a substitute.
No, it's not. They have ceiling fans, and it doesn't cool. The air purifier doesn't cool the temperature. There's no differences in temperature.
So the price information then is just to get an idea of what.
The price information.
The price information that you gave that it costs the same is not for substitutability, but just traditional information.
The price information on electricity costs.
No, you had listed.
Oh, the fact that it's similar to fan. Yeah, I think it was just informational. That's
Yeah, that shows the information. Yeah, for their audience. Yeah, yes, that's right. Okay. So I will move on since I have 5 minutes left. This is just like indoor air pollution levels are brutal. Indoor air pollution levels track outdoor air pollution levels pretty closely and pretty high. There was not a single day when indoor air pollution levels were below what the WHO recommends. Air purifier use is pretty high. Median firm use it for 4 to 6 hours, but almost 40% of the firms use it for more than 6 hours. Again, this is the lower bound. This is a result to show you that purifier use increases a lot when pollution is high. So treatment firms, they can presumably see it on the monitor, or managers who make this decision, the owner, which is they increase their use dramatically when air pollution levels are high, especially during peaks, right? But they increase their use even when they're around 200 to 250 micrograms relative to when it's less than 50 micrograms. What this means in terms of differences in indoor and outdoor, indoor PM levels between treatment and control firms, it's around 10 to 12 micrograms lower than control firms, right? So panel A is showing you the 24-hour average, panel B is showing you 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. It's much lower. And this is month by month estimates for the PM, the treatment control differences in PM 2.5. This correlate pretty strongly, 0.94, with what the indoor PM levels are like in control firms, right? This is consistent with firms increasing air purifier use in response to higher PM levels. Yes.
Well, just to benchmark those against stuff, I'm just thinking of sort of Namarata and others work
Yeah.
on managerial or masks, or I mean, how should we think about the magnitude?
Yeah. So magnitudes are much higher, but like the exclusion restriction might not be satisfied. So we're also like cognizant of like doing the IB here. Yeah. Okay, so what this means in terms of productivity, so you have 3 panels here. Panel A is looking at the entire post period from April 1st to 2023 to March 31st, 2024. Panel B is just looking at the February and March highest production months. And then panel C is looking at the pre-period for those highest production months before the intervention started. So what you see is that in panel A, a 10% increase in productivity for treatment firms relative to control firms. Panel B, the effects are even higher in the highest production period, and then no effects in the pre-period, which is a placebo. We don't find any change in labor supply.
If it's a percent increase, why should we expect it to be different in high or low production months? If it's a percent.
So that's what I'm saying. So in the high production months, when workers are working faster,
Okay, you just get
more
something
orders.
out of it.
Exactly. Good. Yes, question.
Are these effects all in the high pollution months?
Sorry, so.
Do your output effects all come from the high pollution?
So I'll show you the month by month estimates. So these are the month by month estimates. They look very similar to the U-shaped I show you for the monthly production cost for the control firms. So you see it's high in February and March, but also you see in January, December, there are some effects, and also in April 2023, the first month of the intervention. The correlation between that and the control production costs is pretty high, it's 0.9. The correlation with that and monthly PM in the control firm, monthly PM in the control firms is substantial as well, 0.44, but not as high as the correlation with control production costs. This is strategic. What's happening here is what I said in the starting part of my talk is essentially in the low production ones where workers are working faster, but they can't line up more orders. What do treatment firms do? They close sooner than the control firms. But in the high production ones, when they can line up more orders, they stay up open more than the control. Here.
Given the richness of your data, can you estimate the impact on worker wages?
Yes.
And
So,
think about how this increase in profits is shared between workers?
yeah, so we do that, and worker wages are like increased by 10-12%. The split between how much of the returns are claimed by the workers and how much are claimed in terms of profit, we haven't done. Okay, so this is the profit impact. Again, the same 3 panels you see. 18% increase in profits across the intervention period, higher in the highest production months of February, March, no effect in the pre-period. All right, this is the month by month estimates. We look at the correlation between the month by month estimates and the control production costs for the control firms, pretty high, 0.56. This is the correlation between the month by month profit estimates and the month by month productivity estimates, pretty high, 0.7. This is all consistent with when they can line up more orders, the returns are shared by both the workers and the firm owners. When there are no orders to be had, the returns from the purifier are pretty low. So production slack, which is like essentially ubiquitous in developing countries, it like moderates the returns to these sort of technologies. Okay, so finally, in the 2 minutes I have, let me talk to you about the second experiment. So I've already told you about the design, so I'm not going to spend much time here. We paired, in some interventions, we paired information with credit, information with all of these treatments. So I'll just show you, so it's just beliefs data on the heterogeneity and uncertainty around what the returns were. When we asked them why they didn't believe purifiers would lead to returns, production slack. A lot of them were like, well, it depends on orders. It doesn't depend on like purifiers. So they were cognizant of that. And no need is pretty similar to what they're saying. Okay. Willingness to pay is very low, 12% of retail. So no one gets close to like this red line, which is your. Okay. But it's correlated with what your beliefs are about firm growth. If your beliefs are higher, your willingness to pay is higher. Okay, so these are the results. Essentially, no effects of information only, access to credit. What works is like money back guarantee with information, and then free trial with and without information. Our interpretation, this is just one interpretation of why money back alone doesn't work, but money back with information work is that counterparty risk. You're not sure about whether you'll get the money back if you don't want to keep the purifier, but the information treatment, which is essentially an extensive flyer, which talks about the researchers involved and provides credibility to the money back, actually increases their willingness to pay a little bit. But again, all of these effects, they increase willingness to pay, and they're relative to the control mean, the effects are really large, 25% or 30%, but they don't take you anywhere close to retail price. So adoption is still very low. Own experience, so we went back, as I said, 1 year after we removed the purifiers to experiment 1 firms, and we asked them how much they're willing to pay for the purifier. Treatment firms' willingness to pay is 80% higher than the control firms. It's 80% higher than the control firm, but relative to the retail price, it's still very low. It's only 23% of the retail price. So, and this is borne out with like revealed, like whether they buy the purifier in that 1 year period. Only one treatment firm bought the purifier in that 1 year period. Okay, which also tells you that adoption is a barrier here. So what's going on? Why is adoption so low? I think one, this is our favorite explanation, there might be others, is like perhaps direct experience cannot overcome these structural uncertainties, right? So when we asked them, so 60% of the owners said there is a lot of year-on-year variation in production. Production is highly variable. We asked them why. They talk about political instability. So Bangladesh's government was thrown out by a mass uprising against their corrupt rule in August 2024. And they also cite market demand. Like market demand is highly variable. So in that sort of context, maybe this sort of uncertainty around production, how much orders they'll have, they want to invest in like this sort of like high cost technology, which is what you're seeing with tariffs as well, right? You turn on CNBC and all they talk about is that uncertainties are reducing like investment by firms. So that might be one too. Okay, so I'll end here just to say that what can we do about this? If like this is a strong case for subsidies here, that'll pay for themselves. The returns are so high in terms of profits, use is so high, firms use it, returns are there for both the workers and farm owners. There's a case to be made for subsidies, and I think the MVPS would make sense as well here. Air quality mandates, we're skeptical about, given command and control policies don't really work. So why would mandating like indoor air quality work? But that's another option. Okay, so let me end here, and thanks so much for your time and attention.
We're out of time. So I know there was some, yeah. I think they're using it across the board. Oh, across the board. Then it would help. Okay, yeah. There's no domestic. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on this third day of the seminar. Thank you so much for inviting us to present this paper, which is joined with Budi Rasasudarmo, who's at the Australian National University, and Hishin Sun, who's now at the Center for Net Zero, but who was also a PhD student with me at Chicago. And this is the first time we present this paper, so we're very much at the stage where any type of feedback is most welcome. And I should also say that we are extremely grateful to the Smeru Research Institute who helped us get that research off the ground in the field. And so we're going to talk about clean indoor air in Jakarta, but in the context of households. So as I'm sure none of you really needs convincing here, especially after Maulik's talk, but indoor air pollution, or air pollution more generally, and especially PM2.5, which are the smallest, most harmful particles, are a major problem, a major health hazards in many parts of the world, including in Southeast Asia. It's estimated to be the sixth highest risk factor for death worldwide and responsible for about 4 million deaths every year. There is some rising awareness about the issue of outdoor ambient air pollution, which has led with information intervention to some adaptation like wearing masks outside. And this issue of ambient air pollution is especially a problem in fast-growing cities. So here we're looking at Jakarta with a graph from our experiment between June and December. And you can see that the levels of outdoor PM are around maybe 40 or 45 microgram per cubic meter, which is like 3 or 4 times the daily average recommended by the WHO, but up to 9 times around that period, the annual average recommended by the WHO. And so there's some adaptation, people wear some masks, but of course, people spend most of their time indoor. And this is a context where indoor is not a protection against air pollution. So we can see in Jakarta here, where in green we have levels of indoor air pollution in the control group that did not receive an air purifier. And you can see that basically indoor and outdoor really map each other really closely. Why is that? Very high infiltration from outdoor air pollution, as well as some local sources like smoking or cooking, which we investigate in more depth in a more descriptive paper.
Looks fabulous relative to Dhaka.
Pros and cons of going after Maulik, I guess. And in this context, as you know, there was in Dhaka, there's very low level of adaptation, very low level of adoptions of air purifiers, including by households. And so the overarching question in this project is why? Why don't households protect themselves against these high levels of air pollution? And there are many potential explanations. So we're going to tackle this question through 2 specific angles. And we're going to test this. So there's 2 candidates. The first one we're going to test is information friction, and we're going to design and implement a randomized control trial to get at this. But here, when I say information friction, we're going to go beyond generic standard information friction. Do you know how bad air pollution is for you? This type of information flyers. And we're going to test a specific type of friction, which is going to be the lack of experience. And in particular, we're going to provide evidence that we're going to ask whether clean air or clean indoor air in that setting is an experience good, which I'm going to define in a second.
Sorry, just to kind of motivate that, what does the health literature tell us about how visible or apparent improvement should be at that kind of level? So Maulik was saying you see it within 48 hours if you're at 200. At 40, would we expect that the kind of physiological symptoms should improve?
Open question. I think a little bit like what Maulik said, in controlled settings in the lab, there's some evidence that if really like the PM decreases, people would notice it. But in real world setting, and especially when we designed the experiment, there was no such evidence. And what I'm going to show you is that people do notice it. So we have enough of a decrease in PM that people do notice it. And in terms of biometrics, we do have some effects in terms of decrease in blood pressure, increase in blood oxygen, and improvement in sleep. So we think we're also contributing there. And then we're going to leverage also cross-sectional variation within a sample to understand how income or limited income is limiting adoption and how that may interact with the lack of experience. And as you may have picked up by now, we're going to study this question in the context of Jakarta, which is going to be a pretty ideal setting for our question because very high level of both indoor and outdoor air pollution, increasing awareness about outdoor issues, but very little awareness about indoor air quality. Before diving into the design, let me give you a very quick overview of our 2 main findings and contribution. First, we're going to provide what we see are the first causal evidence that clean indoor air is an experience good. And second, we're going to show how this lack of experience hides the role of income in the overall limited adoption of purifiers. So first on experience good, what is an experience good? An experience good is a good whose quality is revealed only after consumption. It's a concept that's pretty widespread in the marketing literature to think about private good, but that has not been tested causally in the environmental literature. There's some theoretical or correlational evidence, but here we're going to provide some causal evidence. We're going to show that the experience of clean air is leading to an update in beliefs about the levels of air quality, as well as the impact on health, and so biometrics corresponding changes. We're going to design an experience that's going to rule out other mechanisms, like learning about the product's, the air purifier's functionality. So it's really going to be coming from the experience of clean air. And so what that means is that low experience which is in the status quo, is gonna lock in low demand. And so if you're thinking of using willingness to pay estimates for purifiers, for policy, as like how much do people care about clean air, you're gonna systematically underestimate that demand because of this vicious cycle. In terms of income in the control group, and which I'm gonna call the status quo, we're gonna find no income heterogeneity in the willingness to pay for air purifiers. However, our experience is gonna shift or increase willingness to pay for air purifiers among the high income households alone. And so what that means is that the status quo adoption patterns are gonna understate the true income gradients of purifier demand. Okay, if there's any question at that stage, I'll take them, otherwise I'll move on to tell you more about the design. Yeah.
I just wonder if you can benchmark it using quasi-experimental variation from like fuel conversion, if people have experienced better indoor quality as a consequence. You
So-
should probably observe similar increase in adoption.
Yeah, so one thing we could, so there's very little variation within Jakarta in terms of like spatial variation. We only run our experiment between the months of May and November, which is the highest air pollution month. It's lower during the rest of the season, but we hypothesize, and that's just anecdotal evidence, but that the strike, like part of the learning and part of the experience comes from, it's very polluted in your house, you turn on the purifier and really notice that in like half an hour, the air quality significantly improved, which I think is type of variation you would not be able to notice with more gradual fuel conversion. Yeah.
I know you talked about the marketing literature and that terminology. Now, in the economics literature, there is experiential learning versus social learning. Like how does this fit in that?
So by social learning, meaning like you had a
I
purifier and so you tell me about it?
Your sister tells you about it, or you observe your sister's house or something.
Yeah, so here we're gonna have very little like spillover effect, I guess, of social learning. And so we really see it as this is in my house, and this is how I'm learning. The caveat here is that people don't have purifiers, don't have access to purifiers. So we can't leverage any heterogeneity and, oh, you had a purifier at your work, and so you've been exposed to it. Okay, so to fix ideas and motivate the experimental design, I'd like us to start with a very simple problem. So let's think of a household who's deciding whether or not to purchase an air purifier. AP to maximize the utility subject to a budget constraint, with C being any residual consumption. If we observe low demand, low willingness to pay for air purifiers, where may that come from? Well, that may come from low income. That's the high marginal utility of income avenue. Or that may come from low perceived benefits of air purifiers. If we observe that our experience of clean air is shifting this willingness to pay, shifting this demand for air purifiers, what may be going on? Well, there are several channels. First, it may be technology learning. So you're learning about how easy it is to use the purifier, how much electricity it's using, how noisy it is, how much airflow is happening. Or you could actually be learning about the problem, the air quality. And namely, you're going to see that the air purifier is going to change your air quality, which potentially is going to lead to a change in your health and well-being. And we're going to design an experiment to really target this second channel, because that's really what we want to look at. There is some evidence, I must acknowledge that technology learning is a big reason, or like a substantial reason, for limited adoption of new devices, but that's not what we have to hear. Yeah.
Back to the previous question about, do you think people are learning in the non-polluted months? And how should we think about that type of experience?
So if people were learning in the low pollution months, then whatever experience we're going to have is going to be on top, because everyone experiences the low pollution month, including the control households. We do think there's something about, so that's a kind of descriptive evidence that we asked about, like, how did people notice that the air quality was better? We do think the kind of threshold is not the right word, the sudden decrease in air pollution, the short-term improvement in air quality is really a major thing for people to notice the change in air quality. But that's okay. So how do we get at this? How do we design an experiment that really isolate this channel? We're gonna design an experiment with two groups. That's going to be the main treatment. I'll have another treatment arm later. In the treatment arm, the main treatment, households are going to receive a purifier and a monitor for a period of 2 to 3 months. In the control group, households are going to receive a fan. This fan is going to be the same purifier device without the filter. All households before this randomization at baseline are going to be shown a generic a video that we made in partnership with a local NGO that's going to cover kind of like the generic and theoretical information about indoor and outdoor air pollution and purifiers that you could have access in the real world. And that's going to ensure that whatever effect we're going to estimate from the treatment is not coming from treated households also learning in the process about air pollution, like about the kind of theoretical information related to it. And second, why do we have a fan in the control group? It's because we really want to make sure that everyone, both treated and control households, are learning about the technology itself, how much electricity it uses, how much air flows, because in the pilot, unlike in Maulik's case, when we asked households what did they like about the device, one thing that came up a lot was they really liked the airflow. They really liked the fan. They said it was a really powerful fan. And so we really wanted to disentangle that to make sure that the estimated effect on willingness to pay is going to come from air quality. Yeah.
So I think it's great that you have the fan as a placebo. I had 2 questions. The first was, is it like literally the same device? Like, and you just pulled out the filter?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. The second question is, I'd be very curious, I guess you didn't run this, but I'd be very curious if you didn't have the monitor.
It is coming.
Is that coming?
It is coming, yeah. Yeah, and then last element in the design, because here the experience, actually getting the experience of clean air was key. We gave households incentives to keep the device on for at least 14 hours a day, which also gives us then real-time data on air quality in both the control and treatment arm. In the control, so it records the air quality, but households don't see it. And here so in reported use, we have the average reported use being around 15 hours a day. We try to compare that with actually the data that is transmitted. However, we had pretty substantial issues with Wi-Fi connections and data transmission. So we can't reliably or easily use the transmitted data to assess that they're actually using it 15 hours. However, for the households that didn't have Wi-Fi issues, we see a very positive correlation between reported and transmitted. And there doesn't seem to be a difference between the different treatment arms in terms of both reported and transmitted. Okay, in terms of the experiment, we first conducted a baseline survey where we also installed the monitors for the treatment arm, so they were able to see what was air quality in the absence of purifiers. Then we installed the devices. We collected data during the whole experiment. We did an inline survey with, we elicited willingness to pay for air purifiers with a BDM approach, and then we picked up the devices. So in terms of the data we collect indoor and outdoor PM 2.5 levels all the time, conditional on our Wi-Fi data issues. Then at both inline and baseline, we collected data on knowledge and beliefs related to PM 2.5 levels, impact of PM on health and well-being, as well as health biometrics. And then at inline, we conducted a willingness to pay, we elicited willingness to pay for an additional 2 months purifier rental with a clean filter using BDM. Yeah.
But the control group informed that they don't get the purifier?
Yes.
They was framed like, here's just a fan for you to test.
Yes. Yeah. And they still got the information on air quality and etc. at baseline. Yeah.
So why would they use the purifier if they know it's only a fan?
Oh, because we compensated them for it. So the incentives we gave for using the device for at least 14 hours a day is pretty substantial. And so that seemed to have been enough for them to use the device.
And those who didn't get compensation, they use it as well.
Everyone got compensation.
Oh,
Sorry, where you're eliciting willingness to pay, it's excluding then the incentive for use, presumably.
It's yeah. So
but you don't see their use in the absence of the incentive?
We don't see the use in the absence of the incentive, no. So unlike in Maulik's households paper in Dhaka, where use is really a key channel. Here we, by design, try to get rid of that channel to really understand if you get to experience clean air, how does that affect your beliefs and your demand? Okay, we conducted our experiment with around 600 parents. That's for the main treatment arm of a public elementary school children in Jakarta. A sample covers lower and middle income households in the city, and the reason for that is that we collaborated with the Jakarta Department of Ministry of Education, I don't know what the official title is, to get a sample frame through public schools, and public schools are disproportionately affected, disproportionately attended by lower and middle income households. We randomized treatment at the classroom level to minimize spillovers, and we stratify. We ran the experiment in 2024 between June and December, and we have a balanced attrition between baseline and line across treatment arms and characteristics. And here, for everyone running experiments, just mentioning that an attrition of 6% in a fast-growing cities like Jakarta is very low. And our understanding of how did we manage to get such a low attrition is because we collaborated with the schools. And so adding some amount of institutional nudging seemed to have been really efficient. Okay, so now that we know the what, the who, the why, let's look at what we found. So first, in terms of status quo descriptors, that's going to be either control group or baseline. We find that indoor air pollution levels are high, even higher than outdoor levels. As I say, infiltration from outdoor as well as local sources creating really high peaks. Average PM2.5 in the control group being around 45 microgram per cubic meter, especially high at nights when people are more likely to. The second thing is that households at baseline have relatively accurate beliefs about the AQI of outdoor PM2.5. So here we're asking households, say in the past 7 days, how do you think air quality was outside your house on the AQI scale, which we have discussed with them before. And you see that there's a substantial amount of households saying that it was unhealthy or unhealthy for sensitive group, and that's even sometimes worse than the air quality that was actually measured. The picture is very different once we move to indoor air quality levels. So households disproportionately think that indoor air quality in the house is moderate or good, while outdoor levels show much higher levels. So about 66% of households believe that underestimate the indoor air pollution, which is consistent with indoor air quality not being directly observed. Yeah.
So the order of asking outdoor and indoor?
That's a good question. I need to check. Yeah.
Good question. What's the role of AC here? Do you measure people's beliefs about how it affects air quality, and what's the adoption rate?
Yeah, so people don't really understand how AC affects air quality. Like I think about half of the people believe that AC is great for air quality.
So do they view this as a substitute?
So very few people have AC in our sample, less than 10%. People have fan, but not AC. Okay. The third thing is that air purifiers are very effective in that context, are decreasing indoor air pollution. So here in green, we have average indoor air pollution by hour in the treatment arm, and we see a substantial decrease of around 15 microgram per cubic meter all over the day. That's around a 30% decrease compared to baseline. And this is the context where doors are open, windows are open, there are holes in the walls. And so as in the Dhaka context, air purifiers, even if imperfect settings, seem to be very efficient. Yeah.
Tell them to put the air purifier in the kitchen or in a specific room? Or?
So for a lot of our households, there is basically one room or two rooms with no door between the rooms. We did advise households to put the purifiers in the bedrooms, but that was not respected all the time. We do have data on who put the purifiers where. We have not really played with it as much, but we think it may explain some of the health results that I'll show you. Okay, so despite this very effective air purifiers, demand, yeah.
Is the fan affecting also indoor temperature? Should also have an effect on health?
So if that we cannot measure, but if that was the case, then we would be measuring, we're really going to be capturing the difference, right? So the control would also be affected. Okay, so despite this effective air purifiers, demand for air purifiers in the control group, because we only did the BDM, the willingness to pay station at end line, is very low. Here you can see the inverse demand curve. There's more than 50% of households who just have zero willingness to pay for air purifiers. Some of them even refuse to participate into the exercise. And we find that the average willingness to pay is around $1.4 for 2 months, which if you take that to a year and you level that back to willingness to pay for 10 microgram decrease per cubic meter annual, which is a pretty standard way of measuring demand, this is very low. Yeah.
Is this the baseline willingness to pay before any of your information treatments?
So this is the willingness to pay for the control group.
Okay.
After at end line. So if you want, this is like status quo if people are exposed to the information that is out there and that they've been in touch with us for 2 months where we've been asking them questions about air quality. So in a way, this is even like an upper bound. And interestingly, there's no significant difference in this willingness to pay across the above and below median income groups. Okay, so does the experience of clean air actually change this? First, in terms of beliefs, knowledge, and well-being. First, we find that households in the treatment arm have more accurate beliefs about indoor PM2.5 levels. Here I'm displaying the distribution of answers for how do you think pollution would be in your house in the absence of the air purifiers. And we see a shift towards red in the treatment arm, which you can also see in a regression setting. So the treatment is improving beliefs. Now, what is happening in terms of health? So I had some boxes, but they didn't go through. So let me walk you through that. We ask, the first 2 columns are only going to be for the second treatments, the second wave of the experiment. We asked them whether or not their health had improved in the past 3 months during the experiment. Found a small and non-significant improvement in health. However, conditional on saying, yes, my health is better. We asked them whether or not the hardware we had given them would be responsible. We didn't ask it like this. We asked an open question, why do you think that's the case? And then we've coded it as whether or not the hardware, and we see a statistically significant treatment effect here. So that means that the respondents in the treatment groups were more likely to say that the device we had given them was responsible for the health improvement they had felt in the past 3 months.
We'll ask about sort of cardiorespiratory symptoms or something we might expect. I mean, in some sense, maybe this is just
it's coming. Yeah. Then we asked them whether or not being exposed to clean air for at least 12 hours a day could have a significant, which is what they would if they were at home, would have a significant impact on their short-term or long-term health. And we see an increase in the share of households responding that being exposed to clean air for at least 12 hours a day could have a significant impact on their short. So in terms of objective health, so this is a little bit work in progress, and I only have 5 minutes, so I want to make sure I'm getting to the willingness to pay estimate, but happy to talk more about it offline. What do we find? We measured biometrics and a bunch of reported, self-reported symptoms. We find that adults report better sleep quality, and there's a small but not statistically significant improvement in sleep length as measured by time use, decrease in pollution-related symptom, decrease in blood pressure, and increase in blood oxygen. We're currently investigating whether small but muted effects come from we just have limited power or from some key heterogeneity that could be driving the results. For example, whether or not you put the purifier in your bedroom, which seems to be important. And then we also measured biometrics for the kids that were in the elementary school kids. And here we see a statistically significant decrease in hypertension, which is a way of aggregating blood pressure. Yes.
You have data on whether people prioritize the bedroom of the kids?
Yes, so we do have data. We have not looked at the heterogeneity there. Okay, now in terms of the mechanism.
But the blood pressure was a biomet, like you actually did.
Yes,
okay.
yes. And we did both endline and baseline on this. Okay, on the mechanism, just to get at Ben's question, what aspect of experience matters? Because the main treatment had both the physical experience of clean air as well as learning about the levels. So in a way, you're learning about the whole causal chain of clean air on health to try to understand whether physical experience was enough, because there's very limited evidence on how do people actually feel clean air. We designed an intermediate treatment arm with just a purifier without a filter, with people not, just a purifier without a monitor, people not knowing how good the air quality was. What do we find? We find that indeed people in the purifier only group don't seem to update their beliefs about indoor air pollution. However, there is a small and not statistically significant most of the time improvement in change in beliefs about the impact of air quality on health. And it's not statistically significant, but we also can't distinguish that these two treatment effects are the same. And so the way we like it's suggestive, but the experience of clean air itself has some, the physical experience can have some effects. And because they're not statistically significant for the willingness to pay, I'm gonna pool both, and then we can look at because I just have 3 minutes, I'm gonna keep going, but we can talk offline. Okay, so once again, my boxes didn't go through, so please just focus on the first column for now. What's the impact of the treatment on willingness to pay for the purifiers? If we just look at the overall sample, there's basically no statistically significant impact. As a reminder, in column 2, when we look just at control, there was no difference in willingness to pay between above and below median income households. However, once we interact the treatment with whether or not the household is above or below median income in our sample, we see that there's a pretty robust treatment effect, positive treatment effect of the experience on willingness to pay for air purifiers, which is around 44%, plus 44% compared to baseline. And when we split the two treatments, it's stronger for the purifier and monitor group, which is consistent with getting the full causal chain is helpful for you to update your beliefs. Okay, so very briefly, I have two last points I want to make. First is we want to argue that the fact that we only observe a treatment effect on willingness to pay only for the above median income households really come from this high marginal utility of income channel, which is consistent with 50% of the participants who refused to participate in the BDM say basically the cost was too high. And we rule out that the high income households would have higher levels of indoor PM in the house at baseline, or that the purifiers would be more effective in these households. And in fact, because the levels are so high in the below medium income households, the absolute decrease in PM from the purifier are much larger in the below median income households than the above median income households. And we can't reject the null that there's similar belief updating across the two groups. Okay, how big is this increase in willingness to pay? Well, we can take the 2 months rental, splitting control and treated between below and above median income households. We can get the annual. We can extrapolate that to the willingness to pay for a decrease in PM, whether or not we assume 24 hours use or reported use. And if we look at this column, the third column, we basically see that the experience that we design, so this 2 months experience of clean air, is basically taking above median income households around Chinese level for demand for air pollution. That is still too low, right? Like the purifier retail is around like $100 or $200 US. Even when you would bring that back to like what it would cost annually, that is much lower, especially because these numbers don't account for the electricity costs, which in our context actually are pretty substantial. I'm gonna finish, but I will take questions at the end. So what do we do in this project? We provide the first causal evidence of clean indoor air as an experience good, which means that in the status quo, willingness to pay for air purifiers is going to underestimate the true demand in a cycle or dynamic way. And yet, in this context, income is still the limiting factor for at least half of Jagnani households. And the willingness to pay after the free trial would still be below the market price, which is consistent with the absence of a broad like market free trial. Like why doesn't the market have this type of free trial if it actually increases willingness to pay? Well, yes, it does increase willingness to pay, but so little for the average households that it makes sense that the market is not doing it. But if the market can't solve the issue, then that suggests there's some room for policy, either putting purifiers in schools or hospitals. There's a most of the health burden of air pollution is borne by the state in Indonesia. There's I I don't know how you call that anymore, but like a French system, basically. And so decreasing air pollution in public spaces could be beneficial. And to the extent that there's spillovers between experience in one setting and experience in another, that could also unlock this kind of lack of experience. I will end here because I think I'm over time, but thank you so much.
All right, we'll have a 25-minute break, and then we'll come back short.
No, 2-minute break.
Okay, sorry, 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. 10-minute break.
Back at 10:15.
We're back at 10:15.
Slide, but I'm gonna make sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I got on the plane yesterday and I'm back to meeting yesterday. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I need to figure out like.
Okay, everyone, time's up. We need to get back on. Thank you so much. We can chat afterwards.
This is not like. Is there another one people were using? Yes. I think this just needs to go in.
Everything I've done is wrong.
Thanks to me, what narrative. Direct message.
Click in the screen.
Oh, it's clicking in that screen. Right now it's on the wrong screen.
Eddie, it's a frost screen.
Yeah.
You need to go right, go right, go right. Right clicking it.
It might not be placed right.
Hey, wait,
Sorry.
We don't know the answer.
Hey.
Always the answer.
There you go. All right. So thanks so much for coming. I'm excited to present this paper with Ben Jones, Ben Olken, and Christina von Dessauer called With or Without You, and the title's going to make a lot of sense in about 2 slides. So there's a lot of interest in trying to understand the effects of temperature on a broad range of economic outcomes for a variety of reasons. To understand overall damages from global warming, to try to estimate in a rigorous way the social cost of carbon, to try to understand where investments in adaptation and damage mitigation are most relevant. And sort of the approach to estimating the causal effect of temperature has converged around estimating sort of panel data models, where you're looking at fluctuations in temperature in a given place, conditional on both place and time fixed effects. And that line of thinking has given rise more recently to an explosion of research estimating not just the effect of temperature, but the nonlinear effects of temperature, motivated by this idea that it's not just temperature averages, but temperature extremes, extreme hot days, extreme cold days that drive economic damages from sort of temperature exposure. And a common approach to estimating these nonlinear effects of temperature or exposure to temperature extremes are specifications like the following one, where you have a location C, we're going to use counties in the US for most of the paper, and a time period T, or years. And you're estimating that on sort of place and time fixed effects, and a series of, and the number of days in a series of temperature bins. So exposure to days under 0 degrees, between 0 and 10, between 10 and 20, days over 90 degrees. And then the coefficients of interest are these coefficients on your exposure to kind of each of these bins. And this has given rise to, oops. What happened to the slide 2? Here. This has given rise to a bunch of estimates like these that look like U-shapes or inverse U-shapes, hence the title of the talk, With or Without You, where you see exposure to extreme hot days, extreme cold days is associated with infant mortality, agricultural productivity, migration, cognitive performance, firm TFP, income, mortality in different parts of the world, etc. So there's been this rise in results looking like U-shapes or inverted U-shapes, sort of showing that temperature extremes are really most strongly associated with economic outcomes of interest. What this paper is going to be about, why did I keep skipping that? Weird. Is that nonlinear transformations of temperature, like binning, introduce a form of bias when you run those regressions. And sort of perniciously, a form of bias that takes exactly those U or inverse U shapes that have become common in the literature. And the argument for the paper, basically everything we do in this talk, I think can be really sort of summarized by this figure. So suppose what you're interested in is doing what those regressions are trying to do and estimate the effect of exposure to cold temperatures or a cold bin, and exposure to hot temperatures or a hot bin, all relative to kind of exposure to moderate temperatures. Suppose you have 2 locations, the place that's relatively cold, this blue place, and the place that's relatively hot, this cold place. The problem's going to arise because as you're trying to estimate the effect of exposure to those bins, everywhere is getting warmer. Global warming is sort of taking place. So these places, the temperature distribution in these different places are all kind of shifting to the right. What does that mean? Well, the hotter place is going to shift from this dotted line to this solid line. And because it started off from a relatively hotter place, its mechanical, resulting just from that warming trend, exposure to this hot bin is going to be larger than the change in exposure of this cold place to that hot bin, just because that threshold for the hot bin intersects kind of the dense part of this hot distribution and sort of barely intersects the tail of this distribution. That's going to lead to a mechanical upward trend in changes in hot bin exposure correlated with your baseline temperature. It's going to go up mechanically faster in or by a larger amount in hot places and cold places. Same argument in reverse for your decline in exposure to the cold bin. Cold places are mechanically going to lose more cold days because of where that cold threshold intersects this initial distribution than hot places are. So there's going to be a mechanical sort of over time, cold places are going to have a larger decline in cold days. So again, there's going to be the change in exposure to cold days is going to be positively associated with your baseline temperature. So what does that mean? Shoot, why does it keep skipping? That's strange. So this is basically showing that exact same idea sort of in real data from the US. This is the change from the 1970s to the 2010s and exposure to days over 90 degrees in red. And that change is strongly positively associated with your baseline temperature. Hot places are gaining sort of mechanically relatively more of those hot days. And the argument in reverse, for cold days, cold places are losing relatively more than hot places. What that implies, I'm sorry, it's like skipping whenever I click it. Excuse me. What that implies is that as soon as you have an outcome variable whose trends are associated with baseline temperature, as many are, think GDP or productivity growth is relatively faster in cold countries compared to warm places. Mortality is declining relatively faster in cold places compared to warm places, etc. That's going to generate a bias that exactly looks like those U-shaped figures from the start. The paper is going to be sort of formalizing and showing kind of what all this means. That's the first part of the paper, documenting this bias and showing that it can generate these U-shapes that you see in the literature. So one second. Second part of the paper is going to be what do you do about that? Well, you can also see from this figure sort of what you do about that. What you want to do is control directly, to the extent possible, for this change in exposure to these bins that's sort of mechanical, just driven by warming. So you know that cold places are shifting this way, hot places are shifting this way. If you could just control for the change in expected exposure to these bins as a result of that warming process, you could essentially fully absorb that non-random piece of changing exposure to temperature and just be identified off that residual variation that's sort of idiosyncratic. We're going to show you how to do that. And then finally, we're going to take that correction to the data and re-examine some outcome variables that people have looked at and try to understand how accounting for or correcting this bias, changes or not estimates from literature. There was one question, or there were two questions. Yes.
So doesn't like detrending the data at like the region year level sort of like fix this? Like don't papers?
We're getting ahead. Turns out no. At least in the US, that's not going to be the case. So we'll show kind of a range of different specifications that you might think sort of solve the problem. I'll point that out when we get there. But it turns out that one is not going to solve the problem. There was another question. Right. Okay. So this is the outline. In the paper, we have a theory, which I'm not going to present today, kind of working all this out theoretically. What I'm going to do is show a series of simulations, kind of outlining this bias issue sort of point by point with you. Then talk about developing solutions, including that one that I just mentioned, building this sort of control so you can directly account for this non-random changes in exposure. And then we'll talk about a series of reduced form approaches that you might think of, like this one about region by time effects. And then we're going to re-examine a couple of applications, a couple of outcomes, population changes, mortality, crop yields, and crime. So simulations. I'm going to show you 4 sets of simulations that kind of build this argument that but it's the same argument I just described with those two locations in the red and blue before. First, I'm going to basically do a simulated version of exactly that example where we're going to simulate, we're going to simulate an outcome variable, simulate temperature across locations that's warming over time, exactly as in that figure, and simulate an outcome variable whose trends may or may not be correlated with the baseline temperature, and show that when the trends in the outcome are associated with baseline temperature, you get these U-shapes people are familiar with. Next, we're going to continue to simulate that outcome variable, but instead of simulating trends to look like that figure I showed you, we're going to use actual temperature data, which has a whole range of more complicated dynamics, etc., and show that the same bias emerges when you use simulations with real temperature data. Third, we're not just going to pick a random trend in the outcome. We're going to calibrate the trends in the outcome to actual outcome variables people are interested in to show that this actually is quantitatively important, this source of bias for variables people are interested in studying. And then third, I'm gonna take a brief aside and talk a little bit about strategies for estimating adaptation that people have used, which are also sort of flawed for related reasons. But first, there was a question, sorry.
I was exactly going to ask about adaptation, sort of, are you ruling out adaptation by control for baseline temperatures?
So it's not ruling out adaptation, but I think exactly align with your intuition, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. A common strategy for accounting for adaptation or estimating the effects of adaptation is to look separately at places that are hot at baseline and as a result are more adapted as compared to places that are cold at baseline. Now, that's actually, for related reasons to the ones we're just describing, that's going to be flawed because those hot places at baseline and cold places at baseline, their changing exposure to these different bins is going to be systematically different, perhaps. It turns out that's going to be true. And to the extent that that's true in the direction that people are hypothesizing looks like adaptation, it is in the US, that can generate spurious results that look like adaptation. I'm going to show you evidence of that, but in fact are just bias. So this does complicate the way people typically think about adaptation as well. Okay. Just check the time quickly. Great. Simulation 1. So simulated temperature, simulated outcome. Basically, we're going to focus here and for the remainder of the talk on US counties. What we're going to do is we're going to simulate temperature to basically, what easier if I explain it? Take the average temperature in the 1970s of each county as the mean. Then I'm going to say you start at a normal distribution around that mean of the 1970s, and we're just going to like shift each county to the right uniformly, kind of the same across all counties by the amount that counties on average have moved to the right over the course of the sample period. We're going to use that as like basically to approximate that red and blue figure that I started with. So simulate basically uniform climate change across places. It keeps skipping. Sorry about that. For the outcome, we're basically going to simulate an outcome as just having a positive trend associated with baseline temperature or negative trend. I'll show you what that does.
Does it matter how you define the baseline? So if you took the 80s or 90s?
That's not going to make a difference. Yeah. As long as there's heterogeneity in baseline temperature, it's not going to make it. Then we're going to estimate exactly this regression equation that I started with, outcome variable on temperature bins, place and time fixed effects. Remember, there's no causal effect of exposure to these temperature bins on the outcome by construction. The outcome is just a positive trend associated with baseline temperature. And then we're going to estimate this regression for two versions of the outcome, one where the trend is positive associated with baseline temperature and one where the trend is negative associated with baseline temperature. And you get these results. Remember, no causal effect of exposure to each of these bins, just trends in baseline temperature combined with warming causing that problem that I showed with the red and blue graphs at the start. But you get what look like positive effects of temperature extremes when the association with baseline temperature of the outcome is positive, negative, this is negative U shape, minus negative, but no causal effects involved. Okay. You might say like, okay, but that's kind of made up temperature. That's this weird situation where there's uniform warming and there are these normal distributions, you're moving everything to the right by the same amount, blah, blah, blah. What about real temperature data? Which of course is more complicated with more complicated dynamics, more complicated trends. It's not all uniform, all this kind of features of the real world. The next simulation, we're basically going to do the exact same thing, except instead of plugging in that made up temperature data that was just for illustrative purposes, we're going to plug in real county level temperature realizations from 1970 to roughly the present and estimate the exact same regression. So now, real temperature data in here, same outcome where there were by construction, no causal effect of exposure to each of these temperature bins, just this positive trend correlated with baseline temperature or negative trend correlated with baseline temperature. And we get this. So again, U shapes when the trend is positive, inverse U shapes when the trend is negative. These results look familiar, but again, there's no causal effect of these things, just regressing trends on trends. Okay. Now you might think, okay, well, even still, we're making up the outcome variable. We're picking a trend to kind of make an illustrative point. But maybe if the trend in outcome, in general, if outcome variable trends aren't that strongly associated with baseline temperature, this problem isn't that big in practice. So the way we want to check that is to instead of just pick the correlation positive or negative between outcome trends and baseline temperature, we're going to simulate outcome variables and calibrate those trends to outcome variables people actually look at in the literature. And then we're going to repeat the same analysis. One thing that's worth pointing out is that the fact if we recover those same spurious U-shapes and inverse U-shapes relationships here, that doesn't necessarily imply these results are wrong. It just implies that this approach that people have been using, looking at these bin effects, can't distinguish real effects from spurious effects, given the structure and the time variation in these outcome variables people look at. Okay. So the one that I'm going to show you here, although we can do this for a whole range of outcomes, is mortality. What you can see is that if you estimate a county-specific trend in mortality for each county in the US, this graph, the y-axis kind of hides this, but there's a positive correlation between that trend and baseline temperature, meaning across counties in the US, cold places have steeper mortality declines than warm places. And then if you do the same simulation as I just showed you before, but calibrate the relationship between the trend and the outcome and baseline temperature to match this trend, you again recover this spurious U-shaped relationship that is actually of comparable magnitude to estimates of the effect of temperature extremes on mortality in the literature. So to benchmark it, this Jeanne and Greenstone paper studies a related specification where they're looking at the effect of temperature bins on mortality in the US, and they estimate that the less than 10 degrees Fahrenheit effect is 3.4. Here we get 3 and change. But this is the spurious version, only driven by regressing trends on trends. Again, it doesn't say this estimate is wrong. It's saying this approach can't distinguish these spurious effects from causal effects. Adaptation. So this already came up. But in addition to estimating the direct effect of exposure to temperature extremes on outcomes, people are often interested in understanding not just that average effect, but the extent to which it's mitigated by experience or adaptation investments. And a common approach for doing that, oh yeah, sorry, question.
Can you say a little bit more about how this is related to binning? I guess I can see in the simulation how you've introduced endogeneity, but is it like, would a polynomial help, or is it specifically binning, or is it just endogeneity?
That is a great question. So actually, before I get to adaptation, let me just answer that and related question. So the answer is, you're totally right. I focused the entire conversation on binning, but you're right also that the intuition suggests that it shouldn't just be about binning. It should be about anything that constructs a nonlinear form for exposure to temperature, and you're exactly right. So binning is kind of intuitive, and it's probably the most common way of estimating some of these things. We show in the paper that, first of all, we picked one way of binning. You could imagine wider bins, narrower bins, a whole different way of thinking about the bin thing. You have problems there too. You can think about polynomials, problems there too. You can think about different functional forms like killing degree days. So this is commonly used in estimating effects on agriculture, where you're looking at cumulative exposure to degree days above a particular threshold. That's another nonlinear transformation. You have problems there and spurious effects there as well. So I'm kind of talking a lot about binning. It's any nonlinear parameterization. While I'm here, there are other choices that I've made kind of to show you these results that none of the results hinge on. I'm showing you county level results at the year level. We could look at state level regressions, no difference. So instead of year, we could look at decade level, which is common for studying long run effects, no difference. I don't think I mentioned this actually. We're using data from the ERA5 land reanalysis data for the measuring temperature. We could use data from PRISM. We could use station data from GHCN. None of these specific choices actually make a difference. It's kind of going to be true, no matter how you do it. Yeah.
What about first differencing? That's what we usually do, right?
First differencing the bins?
Yeah, either any measure of temperature, because we know it's not stationary, so like we want to take out the trends.
So I've actually not seen specifications where you're first differencing the bin. I'm going to show you one way to think about that not working. First differencing the outcome is going to work to the extent that the first difference in the outcome is no longer has trends associated with baseline temperature, which it may or may not. But I'm going to get to kind of solutions and ways of thinking about this in a second. Yeah.
Is it just differences in trends that matter, or is it differences in starting levels?
Of what?
Of your outcome variable?
It's going to be differences in trends. So the outcomes can start at different levels. So long as the trends in those outcomes are not associated with baseline temperature, basically you shouldn't have a problem. And I think I skipped over showing that directly. I don't know, maybe I should go to the slides last minute. You can show directly that if you kill the trend, the relationship between the trend and the outcome and baseline temperature, you no longer get these effects. All of these are precisely the same. Yes.
You've been talking so far about sort of yearly variation in mortality and crime. If you had daily crime data and daily mortality data and like location year fixed effects, such you're only exploiting within place year variation, would that matter?
It totally would. So that's going to be one way of thinking about how to build solutions to this. So first of all, the whole story that I started with over here, this is all, the problem arises because over the sample period, there's some amount of warming, sort of shifting things to the right. To the extent that you're focusing on 1 month of data over the course of which there isn't systematic warming and you're looking at day variation, this is not going to be an issue because there's no warming that's sort of causing this problem. Now, your second question is, well, what if you have sort of longer variation, but you restrict on variation within a particular year, or even within a particular 5-year window, because you're only making comparisons within a relatively narrow period of time within which you don't think there's very much warming? The answer is that's actually going to be one solution that's a little more off the shelf that you can use to solve this problem. The challenge with that is that that's not applicable in a range of cases where you're really interested in longer run changes, decade to decade changes, changes across years that take time to accumulate. And so, but that's going to be exactly the intuition behind one of the solutions you can do to this, 100%. Let me just say one thing about adaptation before moving on. So exactly. So the idea, go back to this question about adaptation, not just the average effect, but that the effect can be different depending on your experience with exposure to heat. So the idea is that to understand adaptation, one thing you can do is to estimate versions of this regression separately in hot places and cold places. Hot places we think are already adapted in some sense to extreme heat. They've already made investments that allow them to the effect to be more limited. And then you can interpret that difference in effect of extreme heat between the effect in hot places and the effect of cold places as the effect of adaptation. However, everything that I've already suggested or showed says that, well, that interpretation of this difference between the effect in hot and cold places depends on whether there are differential trends in hot and cold bins in hot versus cold places. If there are, then any of those differences can just be driven by differences in the extent of bias and not differences due to adaptation. And in fact, sort of unsurprisingly, actually, when you start thinking about sort of these distributions moving to the right, there are these systematic differences. So just focusing on exposure to the over 90 bin, unsurprisingly, hot places have a much steeper upward trend in exposure to that over 90 bin than cold places. However, the theory that I haven't presented to you, so you wouldn't know this, tells us that it's not only about the magnitude of the trend, it's also about the precision of that trend. So this is actually much, much, much more precise than this one. And it's going to be the ratio of those two that ends up determining, how big bias is. I'm not going to go into detail there, but I can just show you reproducing the simulation I just showed you before, but now estimating things separately for hot and cold places, above and below median temperature in the sample, you get this. So blue is the effect of these bins for below median temperature, red is above median temperature. And this basically looks like adaptation, but it's all spurious, which is to say that the effect of extreme cold in places with above median baseline temperature is much larger than the effect of extreme cold on places below median baseline temperature. And the effect of extreme heat is much larger for cold places than for warm places. So we say, oh, wow, that's consistent with these warm places making all these adaptive investments, etc. In this case, it's all just spurious. All right. I already talked about this. Questions before getting into what did we do about this? That all makes sense. Yes.
When you think it's all spurious, I don't know which of the simulations you're referring to, because one of the later simulations you were saying this is some combination of bias and a real.
Oh, sorry. Yes. In what I'm showing you here, this is all spurious.
Okay.
That said, when you think about actual regressions people look at on outcomes, we don't know yet if those regressions in the literature are driven by this spurious effect or causal effects, because we haven't yet distinguished between the two. But what I'm showing you here is all spurious because I've made the outcome variable such that there is no causal effect of these things, only a trend.
Thanks. Would that imply though that all estimates in the effect are at least too big?
Not necessarily. It depends on the correlation between. I'm going to show you one example actually where the estimated effects are too small, because this can bias you downward. And you can uncover effects actually you might not have thought were there otherwise, because this is pushing you towards zero. It depends on the relationship between trends in the outcome and baseline temperature. So imagine you had estimated for example, this one. Oops. Imagine this were an outcome variable where you had estimated zero effect, but the bias is pushing up. There might actually be a negative effect that you then uncover. Yes.
Another functional form that I don't think you mentioned earlier is relative anomalies. So once you bake in adaptation or you bake in the baseline temperature and just compute like relative percentiles of the distribution and let the distribution move on like over time. So it's not, yeah.
Yeah, so that's gonna introduce other complications, which is you're estimating a different object when you're doing sort of relative to your own mean, because you're not able to say, then what does it mean to be exposed to days over 90? Because it's all relative to that own place's past experience.
Yeah.
But versions of that same issue can still arise.
But that bakes in the trend, right, though, so I don't, like, it's not trended anymore. Because you allow, I mean, the 90 percentile, again, it's difficult to interpret that, because it's gonna be 18 or 25 degrees Celsius or whatever, but you bake in like the trend, so like you purge it out by doing that, especially if you allow that for the moving average.
Because it's all relative to your own, yeah, that's true.
Just clarification because I'm slow. In your simulated data, can you tell us maybe one more time or more detail on what are you doing with the trend on the temperature and the trend on the?
So the temperature is just real temperature data.
Okay.
So except for the first one where I sort of made up temperature data, this is all just real temperature data.
And there is a trend there.
And there is, places are warming up. Yes, yeah, exactly. And the outcome, we're just basically saying that it's just some linear trend of baseline temperature with some noise. And we can change how much noise there is here, and of course that's going to affect the strength of the trend, and as a result, the magnitude of the bias. But it's just baseline temperature times year plus some noise. Okay. So the solution, the kind of theoretically motivated solution, which is the one that I described at the beginning, 5 minutes, great, is that you want to control for that non-random piece of changing exposure to these bits. If you can control for the part that's sort of mechanical due to these distributions shifting to the right, then all that's left is going to be that idiosyncratic. This is all going to be driven by idiosyncratic variation and changes to temperature, conditional on the changes in expected exposure to each bin in each place, and you're good to go. So remember that first simulation, one other advantage of that first simulation is that because we made up the distributions for temperature, we weren't using real temperature data, but we know the distribution for temperature. We can validate this approach because we know what those distributions are. We know what they are each year, and we can literally control exactly for the expected change in exposure of each place to each temperature bin. Sorry, it's given by sort of this formula, but you kind of get the idea in the interest of time. And this was that first simulation that I showed you with the spurious effect in blue. But once you control for the changing expected exposure to each temperature bin, because of the fact that these distributions are just shifting to the right, you kill that spurious effect. That's suggesting that it's working there. And by the way, if we instead program the outcome variable to have a positive causal effect of 50 in the extreme bins, you recover those causal effects while nothing else, and fully eliminate the bias in the blue thing. The challenge with this approach is that in reality, we haven't invented the distributions of temperature. We don't know exactly what they are and how they shift over time. It's a complicated process. And so controlling for expected exposure in each place to each temperature bin as a function of warming requires building some model, in this case, some statistical model of the temperature distribution in each place and as it evolves. And that's a challenge. And so one of the things we've done is figured out to the best of our ability, trying a couple of different approaches, the best way of doing that, which then we sort of validated and figured out that it worked. Long story short, this is just still on US counties. For each county and each month, so Suffolk County in January, we've estimated a linear time trend for how temperature evolves over time at the county month level. Then we basically take all daily temperature estimates from the whole period and subtract off that linear trend so that we basically take all the days in our sample, bring them all in each month, bring them all to the first part of the period, and use that to approximate the temperature distribution of that place. Then we get the distribution for each month and each year by taking that distribution and shifting it forward each year by the linear trend that we've already estimated. So then we have a full expected distribution in each place, in each month, and in each year. Then we can aggregate the monthly distributions to have the full distribution in each year. And we can estimate the share of that distribution, that predicted distribution, in each place and year that falls above 90 degrees, between 80 and 90 degrees. This is basically the same thing as what I was just showing you before, the expected days in each temperature bin, except in that first simulation, we actually knew the distribution, so we could just calculate it directly. Here, we're sort of approximating it to the best of our ability using the full database of daily temperatures, which gives us information about different distributions across places and months and different trends over time. And we can check that it works by basically returning to the simulation. Now we're using real temperature data, controlling for these changes in expected days in each bin. And again, you see that the simulation that I showed you before is this blue thing. Once we control for the expected days in each bin and how that changes over time, we get 0, basically. This is, yes.
So compared to that literature that you cited, Borisyak and Hull, they would typically tell you to use some model that you have what the counterfactual should look like, while yours is somewhat of a backward looking.
I mean, this is kind of that model to the extent that we can put it
So
together.
that would be guided by what the fundamentals are or the projection that you expect temperature to have. So there's some reason that you've chosen this as opposed to that, which I don't quite.
I'm not sure what you mean by that, but this is like.
So for example, in a trade model, you would typically take the gravity predictions to say that this is the projection that the counterfactual is going to look like. You're not going to take the observed necessarily trade flows. You would take some kind of projection of that. So.
Yeah, I mean, if I have 1 minute, okay. So then we can talk more offline. But yeah, if we had some accurate projection of exactly how these things are going to evolve over time, and that worked in simulations, we could use that. Even this is hard to sort of use the actual data and get things accurate. We're not actually using, it's worth pointing out, we're not using like ex post data or data from that year to construct these things in a way that could cause problems, because we're detrending everything for the first part of the sample and then just moving things forward by a common amount. So everything we're using as inputs into this thing are kind of within county or within year. We're not using any county by year variation to construct this thing, which is the variation you actually exploit in the regression. All right, I have 1 minute left, so let me go quickly over a couple things. So you can look at other reduced form approaches that do things that are more like correcting for any potential issue or trend in the outcome variable, rather than actually solving this issue with these right-hand side variables and the way that they're constructed. There's some things that don't work. In this setting, state by year effects, which already came up, don't seem to work, even though you might think that works because you're comparing geographically close places. That doesn't solve these problems. Including a bunch of lags also doesn't really seem to work. Two things that do work in certain applications. One are county-specific linear trends, kind of related to this idea of detrending before. That's going to work well to the extent that the trend in the outcome is actually linear. Of course, you don't know if the trend in the outcome is linear. The trend in the outcome can have all kinds of complicated dynamics, and then this wouldn't deal with it perfectly. Moreover, this involves adding a ton of additional controls to the right-hand side of the regression. So for those reasons, it's not perfect. The second idea was also came up before. It's this kind of short panel isolation. So if you're in a setting where you can restrict to within year variation by adding year by place fixed effects, or even we'll show 5 year by place fixed effects, and you're restricting to only comparing really close by time periods, that can solve some of this bias. The challenge is that, of course, it doesn't work in all applications where you're looking at decade to decade changes, lag structures, you don't have finely grained temporal data, etc. Okay, last 30 seconds, I'm gonna stop each time. I want to show what happens if we apply this to a couple outcomes of interest. And basically, we're going to run the same regressions that we were running before, county by year, temperature bins, place and time fixed effects. Now we're going to add controls for these expected days in each bin to account for the bias. We're going to focus on 4 outcome variables. Population from the US Census. It's interesting because you think that migration or population movement is a response to temperature change. Age 65 mortality rates have been shown to really be affected by temperature and drive a large part of the overall economic damage from temperature. Crop yields, again, agriculture is a really sensitive sector. And finally, violent and nonviolent crime rates, things that have been shown to be affected by temperature as well. Population. So again, throughout, blue is naive, red is corrected. So population movement, if you would just run this regression, you would think that people move strongly into cold places and also to hot places. But that, it turns out, is driven in large part by these trends in population movement associated with the trends on the right-hand side. And once you correct it, if anything, the causal effect of extreme heat is people move away. Intuitive, but you wouldn't have gotten that. That's an example of a result that's uncovered by this. You wouldn't have gotten that if you had just done the naive thing. Mortality. Naive effects, mortality, positive effects of cold, positive effects of hot, substantially attenuated once you correct. The effect of cold is sort of less than half the magnitude you might have thought it was. And the effect of extreme heat is now no longer distinguishable from 0 in this specification in the US. Worth making that caveat. Okay. Agriculture. So this I'm showing you corn yield. It turns out this is not actually very affected by this correction. One reason is that trends in crop yields, it turns out, aren't actually that strongly associated with baseline temperature. So, and intuitively, as a result, not much difference here. Finally, crime. What this does is sort of slightly attenuates the effect of heat on crime, but makes the effect of cold on crime even more negative. So this is telling you that, like, you know, the effect of rising temperatures might not be as bad on crime as you thought, because the effect of heat is more limited and the effect of cold of reducing it. Well, actually, that's not true. It would depend on how these things add up. But anyway, the result kind of changes. All right, I'm out of time, but hopefully I've convinced you that this is an issue with a lot of these specifications, ways people are thinking about estimating damage from temperature. We showed you a bunch of simulations to try to make that point. We showed that this how to think about correcting this kind of based on the underlying issue and how to think about solutions to this problem. And we applied that in a couple of different ways and are really open to sort of comments and feedback on how we're applying these issues. Thank you very much for all the questions.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Sylvia, and I've just started at UC Davis ARE. And today, I'll be telling you about a set of biases, dynamic biases, that arise when using static panel models to estimate treatment effects. I'm doing the same thing that I'm getting the weird slides.
It skips one, so yeah, I don't know.
If you skip one and go back two.
I just started using the
Keyboard.
Yeah.
Thank you for solving the problem ahead of me. All right. Here we go. All right, so as the researchers, we're oftentimes interested in estimating the effects of particular policies or treatments on outcomes of interest. So for example, we might be interested in the effect of the treatment of temperature on the outcome of GDP. Now, one of the most popular ways for estimating these treatment effects are panel models with fixed effects. And by fixed effects, I mean unit fixed effects, time fixed effects, or both of them via two-way fixed effects. In fact, these kinds of panel models are so popular that they accounted for 19% of the empirical papers published in the AER from 2010 to 2012. Now, another thing that's true in applied work, and especially in environmental economics, we're oftentimes studying outcomes in which there are dynamics. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the past outcome, also called lag Y, impacts current Y. There's many empirical examples, and we'll go through this in great detail on the next slide. But what we see in practice is that many researchers, when they're running their panel models with fixed effects, are not including lag Y. Instead, they're using static panel models. What I'm going to show you is that this leads to inaccurate estimates. I introduce a new type of bias, dynamic bias, and then I'll also fix it with a new estimator that I'll explain. All right, so now let's get into some empirical examples to get some intuition on what I mean by dynamics. So the first thing that I want to highlight on this slide is that there's many outcomes that we study in environmental economics where economic theory tells us there's a dynamic relationship between the past outcome and the current outcome. Let's take agricultural outcomes. Since the 60s with Guerrillicus, there's been theory that talks about how things like corn yields past corn yields impact future corn yields through soil health and market demand. Is the case in human capital outcomes. Heckman and many others have written so many theoretical papers talking about how human learning is dynamic. Same thing with the employment and the labor market, the past state impacts future state. And in CO2 emissions, natural scientists talk about how an emissions is a dynamic process. So that's the first thing. Economic theory tells us that there's dynamics in outcomes in many of the things that we study. The second thing that I want to highlight on this slide is that all of these example papers that I've listed are running static panel models. That is, they are not including lag Y in their regressions when they're estimating these treatment effects. So, for the remainder of this talk, what I would like you to be thinking about is imagine I have given you panel data, and you're interested in estimating a treatment effect. And I'm going to be calling that tau in this talk. The question is, you're going to be using a panel model with fixed effects to estimate this treatment effect. Should you be including lag Y in your regression? That's what I want you to be thinking about throughout this presentation. And more generally, my paper is about how does including or excluding past outcomes affect your treatment effect estimates? And what methods can we use to solve for these biases? So oftentimes when I talk to researchers and I say, how would you feel about including lag Y in your panel model? They say, isn't that going to cause problems? Isn't that going to break things? Isn't that a bad control? And the reason for that, right, I know, some nervous chuckling. And And the reason for this formally, the term is called nickel bias. Basically, lag Y is an endogenous variable, it causes bias. And we'll talk more about this. When I talk to some researchers, they also oftentimes argue that lag Y is not needed. They'll say treatment is completely random, and so it's not related to past outcomes, so it's not needed to control for lag Y. So I think that's why, in my opinion, we're in this status quo where a lot of people are running static panel models, even when studying dynamic outcomes.
How do
Yes.
first difference models?
So, fantastic question. So when you include fixed effects in a panel model, you have three ways of estimating your fixed effects. First differences, within transformation, dummies. All of them have this kind of problem. Yeah. We'll talk more about it when we talk about estimation, but thank you for the question. All right.
Also,
Yes.
so in a first difference model, it would be YT minus 1 as a function of YT minus 1.
We're about to do it.
Okay.
So let's talk about it. Let's get a concrete equation up here. So the method that I'm presenting talks kind of about generally estimating panel models in dynamic settings, but throughout the remainder of this talk, I'm going to ground us in the concrete example of studying the effect of temperature, which I'm going to, as a treatment, DIT, on our outcome, which is going to be GDP YIT. And depending on which paper, one uses growth, one uses level. And what we see in the literature is that people are oftentimes running static models. That is, they're taking their outcome of GDP on country fixed effects, their treatment variable, and the question, which is what you were asking, is whether or not they should be including this lag. This is the question in equation form. So on one hand, from economic theory, we know that there's a dynamic relationship between past Y and current Y from the solo growth model, right? On the other hand, authors that are running the static model argue that temperature, once you condition for country fixed effects, is as good as random. So there's no relationship between random treatment and the past outcome. And these authors are completely correct. There is no omitted variable bias. However, what I'm introducing in this paper is a different bias called dynamic bias that is going to arise when you're running this static model. And half of the talk is about dynamic bias, but to just give you some quick intuition for this, fixed effects basically induce a correlation across all of an observations, all of a unit's observations. So if you take a country like Poland, then all of Poland's observations are going to be linked through the fixed effect. So even though Poland's temperature today is not related to the GDP yesterday is related to temperature yesterday. So when you have this kind of correlation, there's going to be a bias. But don't worry, we're going to go into detail. Okay. So for this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the first half explaining some intuition for dynamic bias, why it arises. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to compare this dynamic bias that I'm introducing in this paper, which happens when you do not include lag Y, and compare it to the previously known bias of Niffel bias, which we know since the 80s, which occurs when you do include the lag Y. Spoiler alert, mine is an order of magnitude larger. Then, in the second part, I'm going to introduce my bias correction that solves both dynamic and nickel bias. And I'm going to give you empirical examples in the Dell et al. Example of how this performs in practice. And then if I have time, we'll talk more generally about the literature. All right, so let's go into more detail on the Dell et al. Setting. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to generate a simple model that I'm going to say is the true data generating process. Let's say this is the true model of the world. This is the ground truth. Let's say I could simulate the universe. I'm going to be generating data from this in simulations, so we know what the baseline truth is. And I generate this data generating process off of basically the data generating process in Dell et al. So I'm going to say that our GDP is a function of country fixed effects, temperature, and I am going to include lag Y in there because of the solo growth model, and IID random noise. And I'm going to take the assumption using this literature as true that temperature is a function of country fixed effects and random IID noise. Temperature here is random and not related to past outcomes. All right, so we're taking this as the ground truth. Any questions about this? This is important. Okay. And remember, the object that we're interested in is the contemporary causal effect of temperature on development. So in a simple linear model, it's just going to be equal to this tau. That's the object that we're interested in estimating. And so the question is that if that is the ground truth, if that is the world that we live in, why is it the case that running the static model is going to cause this dynamic bias that I'm introducing? All right, so basically, with this static model, going to your question before, the important thing is that we need to estimate these individual fixed effects, right? So the most common way of doing this is dummies, which is completely 100% the same as doing the within transformation econometrically. and it's also related to first differences. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the math for the within transformation, because if I showed it with dummies, you'd have to see matrices, so it's easier with this, but they're equivalent mathematically. So in order to control for the fixed effects, what I have to do is I have to do the within transformation on all these variables. So if you remember from your econometrics courses, what that means is that you take your variable and you subtract out the average for that unit over all time periods. This enables you to rewrite equation 4 in equation 5, where you have controlled for the individual fixed effect, because now all of your variables are within transformed. Any questions? We're good. Okay. So what we see is that in equation 4, even though our treatment was not related to the error there, what we're going to see, because of this demeaning, now this treatment is going to be related to this error term, breaking the exogeneity assumption needed for unbiased OLS. Let's go into this in a little bit more detail. Okay. So what I'm doing here now is rewriting the equation from the previous slide, but now what I'm doing is I'm putting in the definition of the within transformed treatment. It's a function of treatment in every single time period. And our error term, because we hadn't controlled for lag y, includes the past y term that's within transformed. We can write out this definition, simply this, which is a function of the past treatment, which itself is a function of treatment in every single time period. So hopefully what you can see here is that it's very clear how this treatment variable is correlated with the error term here, breaking exogeneity, causing bias. So this is the intuition for why dynamic bias arises, even if treatment is completely random. As long as there's dynamics in your outcome, if you're running a fixed effects panel model, you're going to run into this bias. Any questions? You understanding? Okay, perfect. So now the intuitive thing to do is, all right, remember we're interested in estimating a treatment effect, and we just talked about how the static model is going to lead to the dynamic bias that I'm introducing, right? So we don't want to be using static models for estimation of these treatment effects. But the natural question is, well, how does this compare to running the classic dynamic model when you explicitly do include the lag y term? So here, we know that this from the previous literature is going to have nickel bias, and how do these two different estimates compare? And I'm going to show you a Monte Carlo simulation that I'll walk through step by step. So there's a lot happening on this slide. What I'm doing here is that I'm creating data from the data generating process that we discussed, and I'm setting the true treatment effect equal to 0.5, all right? So I'm going to generate 1,000 of these data sets based on the Dell et al. Setting the true treatment to be 0.5. On each of these fake 1,000 data sets that I'm creating, I'm going to run the static model, that is, avoid the lag, and each of those estimates is going to have dynamic bias. So if we now look at this plot, on the x-axis, I have the treatment effect estimate. So what I've done here at 0.5, I've done a dashed pink line. This is the truth. This is the true treatment effect. And what I've done in blue here is that I plotted the 1,000 estimates from running the static model on the 1,000 fake data sets. So the difference between this blue distribution and this 0.5, this is dynamic bias. This is how far our estimates from the static model are from the ground truth, that we know the ground truth because we created the baseline data. I did the same thing with the dynamic model where I explicitly included the lag y, and I plotted that distribution here. And the gap between this orange and this 0.5 here, this is the nickel bias. And it might look centered, it's not, it's a little bit to the left. The point is that this nickel bias is significantly smaller than the dynamic bias that I'm pointing out. So when applied researchers are really nervous about causing problems by including lag y, they're incurring this dynamic bias, which is at least an order of magnitude larger. So when I presented this for the first time, someone used the phrase like the cure is worse than the disease, right? When applied researchers are like worried about lag y, they're making their problems worse. All right. So now, does this make sense? Any questions on this? Yes.
How does this change with panel bank?
Thank you so much. Incredible. Like that was fantastic. But any other questions before we get there?
How does this change with the relative size of tau and the variance?
Thank you so much. The closed form solutions are in my paper, but the short thing is that the bias gets worse the higher rho is. Yeah. Thank you so much. So we made the natural question is, how is this changing as a function of t? Because for those of you who might remember, nickel bias is a function of t, it's small with t, same thing with my dynamic bias. So basically what I'm doing now is I'm running the Monte Carlo simulation, but on each of these fake data sets, I'm increasing the number of time periods in the data. Here on the y-axis, I plotted the true treatment effect. That's at 0.5, that's the truth, okay? So when I'm running the static model, in the blue here, the gap between the blue and the pink horizontal line, that's dynamic bias. And it's decreasing as a function of t. But even with 200 time periods, the bias is not like negligible, right? As opposed to nickel bias, once you get to 30, the number of time periods in the del et al. Example, you can see that the bias has already gotten much, much smaller. And this has some, I think, really important takeaways for environmental economics. So let's talk about that for a second. So what we can see is that in shorter panels, both biases are significantly worse. So we need to proceed with caution in short panels. So specifically, there's two things. One is that there's this whole literature in environmental economics about distinguishing between climate change and temperature shocks. And this is oftentimes done by taking long differences. But the thing is that when you take a long difference, you're effectively shortening the length of your panel. So that means that you're working with a shorter panel, so these biases can be a lot worse. So proceed with caution. The second thing, researchers are oftentimes also interested in seeing how treatment effects are changing over time, right? So what they'll do is that they'll take maybe a 30-year panel and break it into decades and basically estimate treatment effects on every single chunk of the data to see how treatment's changing. Then that means that you're estimating your treatment effects on shorter panels. So each of those treatment effects are more likely to have that bias in them. So all of that is to say, when you have a shorter panel, please think about whether or not there's dynamics in your outcomes, even if your treatment is random. I'll just briefly say, sometimes people are surprised that this comparison hasn't been pointed out before. And I think that part of this is coming from the fact that since the causal revolution in 1994, there's this kind of idea that if you had random treatment assignment, if you did an RCT, causal identification was going to be easy. You could take a difference in means and everything would be okay. But I think that what we've forgotten is that random treatment assignment does not mean strict exogeneity. And strict exogeneity is what you need in order for OLS to be unbiased if you're doing panel models with fixed effects. So even if it's an RCT, even if its treatment is random, you have to think really carefully about dynamics. The second thing is that in the econometrics literature, there was an idea that perhaps if you're in a static model, it could be interpreted as a long-term effect. But from my results, we can see that actually it's just a biased version of the short-term effect. Before we move into the bias correction, I want to just briefly say one more important applied takeaway, because this is actually what motivated the paper in the first place, which is that everything I've shown you, all the simulations, have been in the case where treatment is random. But the thing is that we're going to have much worse biases on our treatment effects if treatment is a function of past outcomes. Because then instead of it just being dynamic bias, it's straight up omitted variable bias, which is not 1/t. That doesn't go away as your panel gets longer. And there's a lot of examples of this in the environmental literature, where, for example, you're interested in the treatment effect of an air pollution policy on air pollution levels, but we know that the areas who get air pollution policy changes are oftentimes put in because of past air pollution levels. Or with the priority list in Brazil, we know that the areas that are put on the priority list are the ones who experienced worse deforestation in the past, or which regions get drought relief as a function of past economic outcomes. So in all these situations, treatment is related to past outcomes. But we still see that people are running static fixed effects models, because I think there's just so much concern about including lag Y. There's also a lot of papers that talk about how many microeconomic models imply that treatment selection is related to past outcomes, learning, forward-looking optimization. And the point is that in all of these settings, we need to be controlling for past outcomes and thinking really carefully about dynamics. All right, yes.
So my kind of cynical guess as to why people don't put it in.
Yes.
Put in the lag and kills your significance.
Interesting.
But in your simulations,
Yes.
the bias attenuated.
That's right.
So does it always attenuate or does it sometimes upwardly bias?
Thank you so much for that question. So so this is discussed a lot in the paper. In short, if both your treatment and the autocorrelation coefficient are positive, it's going to attenuate it. So your treatment effects are probably larger than you expected. And then in terms of the significance thing, it's actually the case that lag Y explains so much variation in your outcome that it normally restricts your standard errors quite a bit. So lots of benefits for controlling for lag Y. Thank you for the question. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So now we're going to move on to the bias correction. Yes.
So how is this different from an ANCOVA model in a randomized control trial where we are controlling for the pre-treatment outcome variables? So that's for the standard errors, but it's essentially what you're saying is that if we don't do that, we're also introducing.
Right. So perhaps I'm just additional motivation to be controlling for pre-treatment in an RCT. I'm not super familiar with necessarily what you mean by the ANCOVA, but if we could talk about it in the break, that'd be very fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's move on to the bias correction section. I'm going to introduce my bias corrected estimator, and I'm going to show you how the estimator performs in the Del et al. Example and talk more generally about the literature. Did someone tell me how much time I have left?
10, 11.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, so in terms of correcting the models, I have a two-step suggestion. So the first thing that I suggest is that I encourage applied researchers to be including lag Y as a control. Because as we've seen, the nickel bias that you get when you control for lag Y is smaller than the dynamic bias. That is, the key takeaway is that it is not the including of the lag Y that causes problems. You would have bias anyway, you would have dynamic bias. So step one is control for the lag. And the second step is that you have to fix the resulting nickel bias. So now, yes, Carl.
Just quickly, do you have like a quick intuition for why nickel bias is often small?
Why is nickel bias small?
Yeah. Is it all, is there, yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's the case that, I mean, it's a 1/T bias. So, okay. I think here's the intuition, specifically in the case where I'm looking at treatments. And like my paper is the first one to look at treatments. So especially in the case where treatment's random, basically lag Y is the endogenous variable. That's the one that's causing problems. That's the one that's broken. So basically the coefficient on the lag Y is going to be what's really biased. And then the coefficient on treatment is only messed up insofar that it's in the same model as the corrupted lag Y. Versus if the lag Y is not in there, all of that bias gets thrown onto the treatment. So that's why, so basically it's a spillover bias in a way, which is why it's small, because I'm looking at the tau. Yeah. Yes.
Sort of follow up when you're estimating advanced study models and you want to look at dynamic post impacts.
Yeah.
How important is potentially be if T plus 2D affects T plus 2Y and then T plus 2Y affects T plus 3Y.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So what I've been showing you here are just simple AR1 models. My paper considers a more general class of VAR plus covariate outcomes. So basically, there's an explicit formula for those cases as well, where there's also dynamics in the treatment. So basically, it's also very important in those cases. Thank you. All right, so to correct for dynamic bias, control for the lag Y, and you have to fix the resulting nickel bias. So now we're going to be talking about nickel bias for a little bit. So just as a brief recap, what's causing nickel bias? Basically, as I was telling Carl, is that lag Y is going to be an endogenous variable correlated with your error, induces bias, leading to bias on your treatment effect estimates. All right, so I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but bear with me. When you're trying to correct for nickel bias, I'm going to tell you about two main types of corrections that exist in the literature. The first one that you might be familiar with is basically an instrumental variables approach made popular by Arlano and Bond. Basically, what these researchers do is that they control for lags, they use further lags of outcomes to instrument for lags in the model. What we see in practice, though, is that oftentimes ID methods struggle from a many weak instruments problem and large standard errors. So that's one approach to solving nickel bias in the literature. I'm going to be talking and focusing on a second approach, which I call the analytical approach. This also works in small samples. And it avoids the use of instrumental variables, no ID. But you have to specify a model. And what I mean by that is that you write down an outcome and a treatment equation. And then what I do is I can basically analytically solve for an expression of nickel bias and use that to bias correct my treatment effect estimates. When you specify a model, you have to make a functional form assumption. I try to make this a palatable assumption by incorporating a lot of flexibility in the model. That is, I allow endogenous treatment, heterogeneous treatment effects, which we know is really important in the two-way fixed effects literature. And I'm working on the extension to allow a machine learner to help you select your outcome model here. So that's what we're going to be focusing now, is how does my analytical correction perform, how does it work, and how does it work in practice. So just to give you some intuition for this analytical correction, and the details are on the paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out here the dynamic model. And what I do is that I concatenate the two regressors, treatment and the lag Y, into X to get covariates. I put our parameters together, beta, the treatment effect, and autocorrelation coefficient. And we know we have a closed form expression for this beta. This is just OLS. This is the classic OLS formula, okay? And the thing is that if we decompose this, we get the true parameter of interest that we're interested in. And we have this remainder term where this is the nickel bias. And the reason that this term doesn't go away is because of the correlation caused by our fixed effects that lead X to be related to the error terms. And here's what's really cool about nickel bias and very unique about nickel bias, is that we as economists and econometricians know exactly how it's being created. It's being created by this demeaning. Right? So analytic, we know exactly what's going on. So me as the econometrician can do a lot of algebra to calculate exactly how those fixed effects have made these things related and basically come up with a closed form solution for it. Then you basically can do a plugin where you just correct your original OLS estimates with my estimate of this nickel bias to get an unbiased treatment effect estimate. And I'm very happy to talk about this in more detail, but yes.
So, like this morning's papers, which were RCTs, right? Like,
Yes.
for example, Maulik's paper. So, so often in RCTs, we have, like, we might have a limited budget, we just have post-treatment, like cross-sectional data.
Okay.
Right? So in that case, would you suggest to him, if he was budget constrained, right?
Yes.
So you have that just post-treatment data and then just get a little bit of outcome variables from pre-treatment and control for it? Is that the?
Very happy to talk about RCT suggestions, but it would be okay if we talked during the break, just to keep this flow, but we'll discuss. Okay, so that's basically how the analytical correction is working. I don't think I have time to go into like more equations about it, but happy to discuss. What we probably want to see and what we want to finish is how does it actually perform in practice? All right, and that's what we're going to do for the remainder of the talk. So what I'm doing here is that I'm taking data from Dell et al., which is a country level panel, all right? And I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to fix the dynamic bias. That is, I'm going to control for lag Y in the static model. What we're going to see is that controlling for the past outcome changes the treatment effect on GDP levels by 120% and by GDP growth by 10%. I don't have time to go into this in this talk, but I encourage you to look into my paper. That GDP growth is a transformation of the original GDP levels variable, which actually induces a variation on the dynamic bias that I introduced, but just wanted to mention that very quickly. So that's the first thing. Including lag Y fixes a dynamic bias. How does that change things? The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how my analytical correction fixing nickel bias works in this setting, and I'm going to compare it to the well-known IV alternative to fixing nickel bias. Any questions? Okay. So what I do is that I take the data from Dell et al. And I use the same regressors as they do. I use the same 371 region and time controls. And in column 3, in column 4, here are the results for GDP growth. So basically, including lag Y, you get a statistically significant coefficient on your lag Y on growth. This is a 10% change, and the statistical difference between these two coefficients is a p-value of 0.06. Here, on GDP levels, you basically controlling for lag, you get a 120% change and a change in sign, and you also have statistical significance on the lag Y term here. So what I just showed you was controlling for lags induces a change due to dynamic bias. That's the bias that I'm introducing in this paper. But remember, after you control for past outcome, there's still nickel bias. From what you remember from the simulations that I showed you, that when you have 30 time periods, that's a lot of time periods, nickel bias is going to be small. It's not necessarily dynamic bias, but nickel bias is going to be small. So what we unfortunately need to do is that we still need a bias correct in order to be able to do proper 95% confidence intervals, but we do expect nickel bias to be small in this setting. In practice, people oftentimes correct for nickel bias by using instruments using Arlen-Oban, as I've discussed. And I do want to highlight that Arlen-Oban has 44,000 citations. It's one of the most cited papers of all of economics, not just econometrics, very influential. But I'm going to show you that Arlen-Oban is sensitive to instrument choice in a way that my model is not. A lot of numbers on this table. Let me walk you through this step by step. What I'm doing here in this table is showing you the treatment effect estimates for the treatment effect for tau. In this column, this here is a treatment effect with the nickel bias inside of it. Here, this is my bias correction method. As expected, the coefficient does not change too much, but I still maintain small standard errors, very close to the original OLS estimates, because my analytical correction takes into account that it's a 1/t bias in construction. Now what I do in these three columns with Arlen-Oban, you have to choose your instruments. So what I've done here for this result is taken 3 different sets of instruments and shown how the treatment effect estimates change when you use different sets of instruments. And what you can see is you can get positive, negative, or negative results, and quite larger standard errors. And people, when I was going on the market, oftentimes said that Arlen-Oban is one of the easiest things to p-hack. And this is why, because you have to make this choice of instruments. Now, with the second table, now I'm showing you the results for the autocorrelation coefficient, which is going to be more impacted by the nickel bias. So this is the original estimate. This is when I corrected for the nickel bias, still small, but larger than the treatment effects, but I'm still maintaining small standard errors because of that 1/t guarantee of my analytical method. And we can see here, again, changing the choice of instrument in Arlen-Oban, you can get positive or negative. So you can either get positive, positive, negative, positive, negative, negative, depending on the choice of instruments. All right. Oftentimes at this point of the talk, people say, it seems difficult to control for lag Y. Is there anything else that we can do besides explicitly including our lag Y in our models to solve for these biases? Sometimes people suggest synthetic controls, where you use past outcomes to create synthetic untreated outcomes for treated groups. However, the thing about synthetic controls is that it assumes a low rank factor structure, which does not nest a unit autoregressive process. So basically, if every individual is on their own path, thank you so much. Everyone's on their own path, that does not satisfy a low rank factors thing. So you can't use synthetic controls in this kind of setting. Another thing that people ask is, well, what if I use time trends? The thing is that linear polynomial time trends, that doesn't cover dynamics. And in Dell et al., they have 321 region and time controls, but as you saw from the table, that still does not impact the effect of including a lag Y term. So basically, if you want to control for dynamics, you have to be controlling for lag Y. So in conclusion, thank you for staying with me throughout this talk. This paper identifies a new bias that I call dynamic bias, which arises from running static panel models that is not controlling for lag Y and will occur even when treatment is random. I show that the dynamic bias that I'm introducing, when you don't include the lag, is larger than the previously studied nickel bias in the literature, which occurs when you do include the lag. So you are not better off by not including lag outcomes necessarily. I provide a flexible analytical bias corrected estimator, which provides smaller standard errors in comparison to alternative methods. And in general, I'm an econometrician, super happy to talk on environmental problems. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
We'll take a very short break and then we'll come back around 11:30. Thank you.
We can go.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We're now heading back to the third session in the morning. So Hannah will kick off. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Hannah Farkas. I'm a six-year PhD student at the Columbia University Sustainable Development Program. I'm on the market this year, but this is not actually my job market paper. Rather, this is joint work with another student in the Sustainable Development PhD, Sungmin Kim, who is a third year. And I'm presenting on bureaucracy and political bias, specifically using evidence from flooding. So we know that typically in the course of economic development, it's accompanied by the creation of bureaucracies, which are typically meant to be apolitical bodies staffed by a civil service workforce. However, although these are designed to be apolitical, they're frequently accused of political bias. However, it's extremely challenging to actually test for the presence or the motivation of political bias in these contexts due to a couple of reasons. A, internal bureaucratic processes are very rarely observable. And B, when they are observable, it can often be difficult to find counterfactuals for which we can compare outcomes to. So we're going to take a stab at these problems in the context of disaster aid in the US. So specifically in this project, we're asking, what are the characteristics of bureaucratic political bias in the federal disaster assessment process in the US? We're going to be able to leverage a feature of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's administrative process, so FEMA, which allows us to observe some of those intermediate internal bureaucratic decisions. And then we're going to pair this with ground truth hydrological model data to create benchmark flood data. Just to set the stage even more, we know that flooding in this room is a large issue, but it's also an increasing problem in the US between climate change and just increasing movement to heavily flooded areas. Basically, every state in the US is expected to see increased flooding by 2050. And it's not just coastal, but inland as well. And the government is typically tasked with helping with a lot of the recovery process from flooding events. However, this has also been in the news a lot in the past year. These processes have been accused of bias, and whistleblowers have been alerting us to the fact that FEMA is in the process of being gutted. So this is very much being discussed right now. To just give a preview of where I'm going with this, we find that a single standard deviation in a county's alignment politically with the president leads to a decrease, leads to a 4 percentage point drop in the probability of bureaucrats flagging that county as needing potential public assistance in disaster recovery. We additionally find that this bias disappears in the most severe floods, and it's really important at the marginal flood. And lastly, we find that biases disappear when this bureaucratic process is overseen by a civil servant, so a career civil servant, rather than a political appointee. And I'll get back to that. This really fits in with the larger literature on politics and public institutions, but in the context of disasters. And we support the existing evidence that apolitical hiring has an effect on public sector performance. We also fit in with the smaller literature on the political economy of FEMA. While a lot of this literature has focused on disaster declarations and the ex post assignment of aid, we really focus on this intermediate bureaucratic step, and we look at the county level. Lastly, also in this room, we know a lot about the economic impacts of natural disasters, but a common issue here is that data used to examine these natural disasters is frequently self-reported or from government agencies themselves, And these are often known to have non-random measurement error. So we have two contributions on the data side. The first is the use of hydrological models to create this, this flooding metric that is kind of external to the agencies themselves. And the second is digitized administrative records, which we'll go into a bit more, which outline FEMA's bureaucratic process in this. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, this is a very simplified overview of what the disaster declaration and assessment process looks like. So to begin, let's say that there is a disaster event. Let's say this occurs in my home state of North Carolina. The first thing that happens is that local and state officials like the governor or mayor will come together and try to see if the damage seems like something that they can handle on their own as a state, or if it seems large enough that they think they need federal assistance. If they make that call, then they bring in FEMA. FEMA, being the National Emergency Management Association, conducts a preliminary damage assessment. I'll describe this more in a moment, but this is essentially an on-the-ground assessment of how bad a disaster event seems to be. FEMA then takes that report and submits it up the pipeline to the FEMA national headquarters and then to the president, where the president is then tasked with either declaring a national disaster or denying a request for federal assistance. If a president does declare a national disaster, then we move on to the aid dispersal phase. There are two types of dispersal: individual, which is aid that's open to households to apply to, and public assistance, which is for governments for things like infrastructure improvements. And that's the type of aid that I'll discuss more today. Okay. So yes, please.
Is there research that talks about the returns to this dispersal in flood recovery?
Yeah, there is a bit. Yeah. There's some kind of showing that
4% would actually make a difference in the recovery trajectory.
absolutely, yeah. And because for a county level, the average amount of public assistance that a county gets if it's declared is over $1 million. Just for a county, that can be quite a lot of help. Yes, please.
Do you have a sense of how often the requests are denied, the requests for assistance?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's actually quite common for them to be approved. It's much more common for approval than denial. It's partially because we think that probably they kind of get a sense for if they will be approved or not. Yeah.
Is that where the president declares the national emergency before FEMA actually does the assessment?
Great question. Yes. So if it is something so large, so Hurricane Helene in North Carolina last year was absolutely just devastating. And in those cases, there's an expedited process. It's typically for something like a hurricane that's just really out of the realm.
So the variation in alignment here, does it come from electoral transitions at the federal level?
Yes, exactly. Okay. So the bureaucratic step that I keep teasing is that preliminary damage assessment. This is from the FEMA handbook from 2025, but essentially FEMA is tasked with determining the impact and magnitude of damages and the resulting unmet needs of individuals, businesses, the public sector, and the community as a whole. This assessment process is overseen by a FEMA regional office. And the FEMA regional office is headed by an administrator and a deputy administrator. They are tasked with overseeing that assessment process, validating those reports, and then recommending up to the president whether that disaster kind of necessitates a declaration or not. These administrators, importantly, can be politically appointed. So a president could appoint a political ally to that regional administrator position, or it can be a promoted civil servant. Here's what those, oh yeah, Carl.
Are there systematic differences between the offices that often get political appointees and often or have civil servants?
That's a great question. We don't really see that.
Okay.
Here. Yeah, I can double check the numbers though, it's in the paper. Here's what those preliminary damage assessments actually look like. So these are pulled from the FEMA website. This is from a flood event that was declared an emergency in 2018 in Pennsylvania. So we can see that on the left, it includes a lot of dates about when the flood occurred. And then we have the summary on the individual assistance that requested, just summarizing the number of households that seem to be hit. On the right here, though, we see public assistance. And I'm going to zoom in on this. We see that here, it was assessed that the primary impact and in need of public assistance was damages to roads and bridges, so some infrastructure projects. And then importantly for our study, it also lists the counties that were deemed disturbed by this flood and the amount of per capita damages that they were estimated to have hit. So we compiled and digitized all of these PDA publications just from the FEMA website from 2008 onward. For this study, we're restricting to the 133 disasters that have an incident type of flood as the main event and requested public assistance and actually received it. So this results in over 4,500 observations of county and disaster, which covers over half of the public assistance requests in the sample period. And that's again because flooding is the most common declared disaster in the US. So our observation then is the county level assessments of public assistance needs. And for this talk, I'll only be talking about the extensive margin. So we're interested in just whether or not a county was actually included in that initial assessment and flagged as needing public assistance from the government.
Can you just say a tiny bit more about why? I mean, would we expect the intensive margin of?
Yeah, and we have the intensive margin as well. With the extensive margin, we are curious if just kind of being listed in that assistance assessment was really predictive of eventually receiving aid. So no matter how much aid, but just kind of in general. So we compare this with a number of other data sets, including just the public assistance that was ex post allocated for all of the floods from FEMA. We can also bring in election results, and we bring in county level covariates from ECS. For examining the role of civil servants versus political appointees, we use the Federal Workforce Database, which has the terms of appointment information, from which we can gather whether career or non-career executives were heading the relevant FEMA regional office at the time of the relevant disaster. We can also bring in to test a few other mechanisms, congressional data on whether House members from the impacted state were overseeing FEMA at the time of the disaster. And finally, FEMA budgetary data to see if the drawdown of that disaster relief fund played any impact. And then lastly, we pair this with flood data. For this, we use the Global Flood Awareness System from Harrigan. This is a very frequently used database. It's often used for calibrating flood early warning systems. And in terms of its kind of accuracy, it's most accurate for when compared to actual river observation systems. It's most accurate for the US regions that have frequent floods, which is the setting we're discussing here. A very simplified summary of what it does, it just takes precipitation data, combines it with soil characteristics and topography, and results in a discharge rate. What we do is just take that discharge rate and we get the maximum discharge rate at the census tract level. And for each census tract, we compare the discharge rates to those indicating a 1.5, 3, or 5-year flood. And to get our flooding intensity metric at the county level, we take the sum of housing units values in the census tracts that were experiencing at least a 1.5-year flood during the event. Yeah.
Is household level adaptation likely to be important? I mean, if what you're trying to get at is some measure of damages, you've got some measure of the amount of water.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Presumably that can vary quite a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we're using repeat counties here, like repeat hits of flooding. And because we're not actually looking at the individual level, but we're looking at public assistance, or that there's not much individuals could do. That makes sense. Yeah, but we can talk more about adaptation. Yeah. Here's what that actually looks like at the county level. So this is our flooding intensity metric during a flooding event in Tennessee. This is just the dots are showing Tennessee's major cities, Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville, and Chattanooga. Then we compare it to that inclusion in the preliminary damage assessment. So you can see here that Memphis and Nashville, although they had experienced flooding during the event by our metric, they weren't actually included in that FEMA assessment, whereas Knoxville and Chattanooga were. Then finally, what we're doing is comparing that assessment to whether or not actual aid was received at the county level. And you can see here that because Memphis and Nashville were left out of that assessment report, they actually didn't end up receiving public assistance, whereas Knoxville and Chattanooga, which were included, they later on received assistance. And since this assistance is actually pretty large sums, this could really matter for future development. Okay, so we're assessing inclusion of a county in that preliminary damage report, conditional on that flood intensity metric. And for identification, we rely on the repeat flooding of counties throughout different administrations and with varying degrees of flood intensity. So here's just what we're testing. Like I've mentioned, we're testing the dummy variable on being included in the preliminary damage assessment. So whether a county is included in that public assistance request. Our PA is the dummy variable of actually receiving that public assistance ex post. Then we have our flood intensity metric, which is the log of flooded housing value. Our margin pres, which is just going to be the vote margin in favor of the incumbent president in the recent election, and county fixed effects and state disaster. Yeah.
How much of the assistance is spent on defensive investments that might affect future flooding?
That's a great question. So most of this is not. There are other FEMA programs that are targeted, and it's actually been increasing that their FEMA programs kind of tying receipt of aid to building up kind of defensive measures. But most of this funding is put towards things like debris removal and kind of cleanup things.
No, but you still should be thinking about whether this type of assistance is correlated with the defense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I had a related question. Is there any party variation in how much people spend on defensive stuff? Like I'm thinking of like building up dams or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure actually, but yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I'm wondering if you've thought about like instead of using vote margin in favor, like if I'm gonna be up for re-election in 4 years or 3 years, I might want to target counties where I just lost.
Yeah. So we actually have tests for battleground states. So states that are within like 10%. Yeah. And then we also test on election year. So we can get to that. Okay. So we basically ask 3 questions. First, is there political bias in just requesting assistance? So inclusion in those PDAs. Is there a political bias in receiving assistance? So actual receiving public assistance. And is there political bias in that receipt of public assistance when we account for being in the actual request? Then after that, in time, I'll get into the possible mechanisms, and the mechanism we show here is going to be on the role of career executives rather than of political appointees overseeing this assessment process. Okay. So just a reminder of where we are. First, I'll show results on this step. And just to remind everyone of where we're situated in the literature, most of the past literature has focused on these 2 steps. So looking at the president's role in this, in the disaster declaration and the aid dispersal, but we're looking here at this earlier step in the bureaucratic stage. So here's what we find. Here's our flood intensity metric. And the first thing that's very clear is that inclusion in that assessment report is really strongly predicted by flooding intensity, which is a good thing. It means that the FEMA assessment process is picking up on actual flooding, which we like to see. But then if we zoom in on these political margins, we see that alignment with the incumbent president increases your likelihood of being included in that request. Looking at the interaction of the 2, we see that it's brought down a bit by an increased flood severity. So bringing this all together in a marginal effects plot, on the x-axis, we see the flooding intensity by our metric. And on the y-axis, we see the marginal effect of political alignment on the inclusion in those assessment reports. So this is saying our mean flood intensity is in log scales around 20, and that leads to that 4% increase. So for the average flooding event in our sample, alignment as standard deviation increase in alignment with the president increases your likelihood of inclusion in that assessment by about 4%. It decreases as disasters become more severe. So just putting that in words again, inclusion in the PDA report is significantly predicted by flood intensity, actually by about 14.5%. One standard deviation in favor of the incumbent president leads to a 4 percentage point drop in the probability of a county being included in that assessment. And that alignment bias decreases as flood intensity grows, eventually disappearing in significance. And that aligns with past work by Schneider and Coons, which studies effects for kind of the marginal hurricane. And for disaster declarations, they find that it really matters for the marginal ones and not like the hurricane planes.
Can you say anything about legislators? I mean, they don't have a formal stage in this process, but they can certainly pressure FEMA.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a slide for that in a minute, or a button really, so I'll just tell you now. We looked at the inclusion of a legislator from that state on an oversight committee in the House that looks at FEMA, and we see no effect. And we think it's because this bureaucratic stage is happening before any actual aid assistance, so really before any kind of direct politician involvement. Yeah, please.
Have you looked at whether this effect is larger at times when the overall budget is lower, so it's really just a rationing?
Yeah, great question. We looked at that as well, and I'll get to the button in a moment. But we look at something called the Disaster Relief Fund, which is basically the amount that FEMA is allocated at the beginning of the year that they're drawing down on. We don't find any effects given how much is left, and we think that's because honestly, there's a lot of ways that more money can be added to that pot. So, for example, like back to Helene, that was in October of last year, and although there was, it's late in the year, there's not as much left in the budget, there was no way that money wasn't going to be freed up for that. Oh, yes.
The difference in bias if it's a Democrat or Republican president?
Oh, yeah, we looked at that as well, and we don't see any differences. We see this across the board. Yes.
What role does the policy that FEMA always asks that you rebuild in the same location, that there's no sort of no ability to move back from, let's say, the water, no managed retreat or anything like that? How does that impact the value of those properties?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's probably more we can look into on that, and I'd love to talk more about that after, because right now, because we're looking at the public assistance, it's not directly related. Like the money that's going towards that isn't towards the individual rebuilding as much as kind of that cleanup process. Okay. So now I'm going to look at that public assistance phase. So is there
You had a button about political parties, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
so
You want me to
what's the time period of this?
Oh, yeah, so it's 2008 to present. So I think one of the reasons that probably the political party differences isn't.
Well, I was gonna ask, like, are different presidents different?
Yeah, we don't.
I mean, you might imagine that.
Right, yeah, and I think they're different in kind of the amount of aid, but in this behavior, we don't see a difference. Okay, so looking at the public assistance dispersal. So this is the ex post money that actually goes to those counties. And we see a similar pattern. So it really follows flood intensity, which again, good, but we still see that kind of bump in likelihood of being included when you're more aligned with the incumbent president, and that mediation by flood intensity. So let's look at the two of those together. So here I'm curious if the bias that's already picked up in PDAs kind of mediates the bias in the public aid dispersal. Yeah.
Wondering if the dispersal process has changed like recently since the LA fires, where that wasn't contentious.
Yeah, great question.
But now there's pullbacks and
yeah,
it's uncertain.
Great question. And this, I should say, it ends in 2024, so it's before the 2025 season. But the LA fires is a really interesting example because it took a little longer, but aid actually did end up being dispersed to those counties still. So I think there is something we could do on maybe the length of time between kind of event and dispersal and see if that is also biased. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we substitute towards any other funding, maybe at the state level, if they know FEMA might not look at them favorably?
Yeah, absolutely. And this process in general is set up where the federal government is supposed to be kind of the aid of last resort. Like if a state seems like they are able to handle it on their own, then they should. But if it's large enough, that's when federal assistance comes in. Okay. So here is that the predictor of receiving public assistance given you were included in the request. And the first thing we can see is that it's extremely predictive. It's about an 84% chance that you will later receive assistance if you were included in that preliminary damage assessment. Let's exclude that one and zoom in on these coefficients. We see that basically the flooding intensity metric is all absorbed by the preliminary damage assessments. So we're not learning anything new about flooding's impact on that public assistance receipt, but there's still a bit of residual political bias. So after the involvement of the president or politicians, like you were asking about, Coral, there's still a bit of political bias in the actual receipt of aid that was not there in the request. Okay, just to summarize what I just said, 83% chance of receiving public assistance, controlling for receiving an assessment. But even after controlling for PDA inclusion, that residual political bias is still there. Okay, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to outline one potential mechanism, which is the role of career and non-career executives in leadership positions of FEMA regional offices. And here, the non-career means political appointees. These are the FEMA regional offices. There are 10, and a president is allowed to appoint a political ally to head these offices. They don't have to go through Senate confirmation, unlike the actual head of FEMA. Alternatively, it could just be a civil servant that's promoted up to the leadership role of these regional offices. So this is that same regression, looking at the preliminary damage assessment, the bias in that, controlling for the presence of a career executive rather than a political appointee. So again, flooding intensity is quite predictive of inclusion in the request. We see that margin pres, that political bias turn on. But then zooming in at the coefficients again, we see that this political bias seems to be quite mediated by the presence of a career executive. So this means that if it's not a political appointee, the bias actually declines. Yeah.
Just wondering if you could instead use like retirements of career executives.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah. Thanks. We have a check. I'm not sure if I included the button. We have a check for just number of people in the FEMA regional offices because we were curious about maybe the effects of understaffing, and that didn't seem to have a result, which kind of gets at that. Yeah. But we can definitely do that. Okay. Alternatively, we can look at the effects of having a career executive in charge on public assistance. So again, we see that flooding is quite predictive of public assistance, as is the the margin pres term. But then looking at the impacts of a career executive, we now see no effect. So to summarize, we see that bias is sort of canceled out when career executives lead the regional office, overseeing the disaster assessment process. And the presence of a political appointee kind of fails to mitigate any of that political bias. However, the presence of career executives no longer reduces that bias after the presidential engagement. So at that public assistance phase, when there's kind of this more politician involvement. Yeah, please.
Just wondering what like proportion of kind of heads of these offices were career executives?
Oh yeah, it's I think it's about 40%.
And do they change much in the same office over your set?
Yeah, I can get the stats in a moment if we talk, but it's, yeah, there's variation. Yeah.
Just to clarify, I mean, these things happen at the regional office level, these determinations. And sometimes those are on major rivers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you ever see like, they're not determining it on one side or, I don't know.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Type 1, type 2 error thing.
Yeah. We can absolutely check that. That's a good idea. Thanks. Okay. And just to summarize, we already kind of touched on these, but the balance in the disaster relief fund doesn't really seem to do much. The presence of congressional members on the FEMA oversight committees doesn't really seem to do much here. Same with battlegrounds, we see similar effects. However, we see these effects kind of strengthened in election years. So we take this to mean there's kind of a building up of support in election years, kind of rallying the base. So in conclusion, the process of disaster assessment is not immune to political bias. We see that flooded counties are more aligned politically with the incumbent president. They're more likely to be considered for public assistance. And this is most severe for the flooding on the margin of severity. The disaster assessments overseen by career civil servants rather than political appointees exhibit less political bias. And just as a final note, as I mentioned earlier, the average amount of public aid dispersal per county is around $1.3 million. So it's a non-trivial sum. And it does maybe imply potential need for more oversight or standardization of this process. And lastly, my co-author and I are thinking about how to maybe use this to explore how this plausibly random assignment of public funds can impact post-disaster recovery. So if you want to chat about any of this, please come talk to me after.
Everyone, thank you for the invitation. It's great to hang out with environment development crowd. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a history paper now, and we're mostly going to be talking about data between 1950s and 1971. And the paper is co-authored with Sultan, who's a Pakistani, but based in Russia. I mentioned that because of a lot of the history I'll talk about. I'm going to just specify that. It's written by a Bangladeshi and a Pakistani. And even if you don't learn anything from the paper, we'll learn a lot of fun history today. Some of it's sort of oral history. My parents met and got married in Lahore in West Pakistan. So a lot of it is just sort of passed down, but we're trying to test those types of insights statistically here. Okay, so by way of motivation, like political revolutions, separatist movements are not that uncommon. There's a recent database that tracks about 145 political revolutions, upheaval, separatist movements around the world. But what is relatively uncommon is whether it succeeds in achieving its primary objective of secession. Okay? So that's less common. And one of those successes in 1971 led to the birth of the 8th most populous nation in the world, Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan at the time. And one of the questions we're going to ask in this paper is, can analyzing the success of this movement teach us about conditions conducive to the success of political revolutions? Right? And in particular, the story we'll tell here is that there was a climate shock, cyclone, which remains the deadliest storm in recorded history, even bigger than the Aceh storm that happened much later. And the Pakistan government's indifferent response to the tragedy and the suffering caused by the storm did teach citizens something. It amplified some pre-existing grievances. And what we're going to do is to make a contribution to this. So this story, the historical narrative is well trodden and worked by a lot of historians as well as important actors like US diplomats who were present in Dhaka in East Pakistan at the time. But what we're going to add to this is we're going to assemble some satellite and archival sources to generate some subnational variation in cyclone intensity and exposure to the storm, to understand how people in different parts of the country, different sub-districts all around the country, reacted to this politically. Okay. So a very quick bit of history. So this is
Sorry, Mushfiq, just in terms of the literature on this, like when you said like climate shock serving as a focal point to expose state failures, I immediately thought of like Hurricane Katrina in the US. As like people talk a lot about
absolutely
that.
Yeah.
Are there other examples like
yeah, so there are other historical, so nothing quantitative, but for example, people talk about an earthquake in 1978 in Iran, right, which led to the downfall of the Shah, the Tangshan earthquake in China, right? There are other sort of historical narratives that tell a similar story. And by the way, I mean, this story about what happened in West and East Pakistan, that's the subject of a lot of historical narratives. And in a subset of those narratives, people do talk about the importance of the Bhola cyclone. Okay? So a quick bit of history. So British India got subdivided in 1947 into Pakistan and India, and Pakistan had 2 provinces, West and East Pakistan. So somebody from here, Cyril Radcliffe, so a lawyer who had never visited the region, was assigned the task of drawing these borders. And he was given several weeks to do it, but he actually got done early. So, and we are still dealing with some programs of the borders that was drawn. So one of the strange things here is this was a country, right? And this is a strange formation of a country with 1,000 miles of India, which is not, wasn't friendly from the outset in between, right? So the only thing that was common between these two provinces was religion. That was the basis for this being a country. And the thing that will show up in a lot of our data, and this is the kind of oral history I was talking about, things I've experienced, my parents definitely experienced, is that people do look different, right, across the two provinces. And there was a lot of racism. So taller, fairer skin. Of course, I'm Bengali, but I'm a unusual specimen in terms of height. And a lot of that will show up in how the politics played out. One of the, in terms of the story we'll tell is that we're going to look at two steps to a successful revolution. And then often, if you look at history of revolution and history of state secession and state creation, it often requires two steps. The first step is some kind of, that's what I mean by a focal point. Voting, referendum that coalesces people's separatist sentiments and brings it to the attention of leaders. Like, for example, Croatia had an independence referendum when it was part of Yugoslavia with over 90% support, right? But there is a second step that's required. It's not sufficient for you to just vote for secession, right? Often you're then met with a military response from the incumbent because under the threat of losing territory, typically, the incumbent will react with violence, right? And that's often the step that leads to sort of unsuccessful revolution. And the reason is often the incumbent has, it is the state and the state retains a monopoly on violence. So they have the military, right? And there are many examples of this. Irish independence from Great Britain. There was Sinn Féin had a landslide victory in 1918, but it wasn't until 1921 and civil conflict that Ireland actually gained independence. But what's much more common is unsuccessful attempts at this, right? So for example, Biafra's attempt at secession, there was an independence declaration between, a set of activities between 66 and 67, but only after 1970, they had to finally give up because Nigerian military was able to overpower the separatist group. The Sri Lankan civil war lasted much, much longer. The Tamils, LTT, which is the separatist group or the army that was representing the Tamils, they formed like in the early 1970s, but only after the LTT leader is killed in 2009, after 30 years of civil war, did that war finally end. Okay, so that's, we'll hopefully say something about political revolution, but I want to give a second motivation that's much more relevant to this conference, which is this pattern that's surprisingly consistent and common that in Jacob's talk today showed up as well, is that, there's an influential review by Sol Xiang, Marshall Burke, and Ted Miguel that synthesizes a lot of studies, right? And what they show is that consistently, when you have deviations from normal temperature, normal rainfall, right, that leads to increased conflict risk. And today we learned that even after you correct for the U shape, it still exists. Yeah? Now, what's unclear though in that literature is that while that pattern is extremely consistent across like millennia, right? Sometimes it also includes archaeological research, right? The specific mechanism by which weather variations and climate shocks affect political violence, right? That's not so clear, and we're going to paint that detailed story today for one important historical case. Okay, and this is, I think, important partly because it's not just about temperature variation, but most models from climate scientists suggest that it's going to increase the frequency and severity of natural disasters, right? And if that has political and conflict implications, we should try to understand them better, right? So in our case, we'll eliminate the detailed mechanism where we'll get data on the cyclone, the effect of the cyclone, the government's response or lack thereof, right? And then we'll also involve data on voting behavior, so electoral support for separatism. And finally, the important one that's really critical here is what induces people to take the very risky action of taking up arms, right, and engage in guerrilla warfare against a military. Okay, so 1970 is, I mean, I'm talking a lot about 1970, 71, but the grievances did not start there. So pretty soon after Pakistan was formed, right, we had the Bhasha Andolon, a language movement, and that came from the Pakistan government's Muhammad Ali Jinnah's declaration that Urdu and Urdu alone should be the national language of Pakistan, right? And so our independence movement really started as a movement to speak our own language. Yeah. But there were a lot of economic grievances as well. So while East Pakistan constituted the majority of the population, over 60% of the population, we received only 29% of the government budget. And what was sort of adding insult to injury is that most of the foreign exchange earnings for all of Pakistan came from East Pakistan because we produced about 80% of the world's jute. And that was a commodity high in demand during that period because of all the wars that were going on, the Korean War, Vietnam War, etc. That led to demand for sandbags, and jute was the commodity being used for that. And so what was happening, so when we had this movement, a 6-point movement, 1966, and an architect who I'll also talk about today, he'll play some role in this, was an economist. And they wanted, in this demand for autonomy, was a demand for separate currencies. So just to break that cycle of exports from East Pakistan getting reinvested in the West, right? So there was a bit of, so people perceive this as a form of neo-colonialism, economic extraction, right? But also dominance politically. The center of power always remained in West Pakistan, in Islamabad. Right? And throughout its history, like Pakistan was never governed by a Bengali. Yeah? And it's also true in the military, right? There was only a handful of Bengali officers, and the military was almost entirely West. So the specific events that I'll collect data on, speak a lot about is November 12, 1970 is when the cyclone makes landfall in coastal Bangladesh, in the Bay of Bengal. And just in a fortunate coincidence, the first election in Pakistan in 16 years was scheduled 4 weeks after the landfall. So you can imagine that what happened with the cyclone was very salient to people at the time that they were going to the polls, right? Now, so Bengali party does win, right? So basically what happened at this point is that majority of the population is in East Pakistan, majority of the parliament seats are. So they win, they're supposed to form the government, but instead, instead of handing over power to a Bengali, they handed over to the military. And the leader of the party that won, the Awami League, right, he's taken to West Pakistan and jailed. And then on the night of 25th March 1971, Operation Searchlight begins, which is basically, because we didn't have a military, the shooting of a lot of civilians. So that's the night that we declared independence. But this war, what I'm calling guerrilla warfare, the insurgency, that lasted 9 months, and it bought time until India finally intervened. Around December 4th is when India intervened, and by December 16th, the war was over. Okay? So we're going to look at voting here. We're going to look at who decides to participate in the guerrilla warfare here, right? And the third thing we'll look at, and here I have to be careful, the data isn't great on the third thing. So just take this always keep this in the back of your mind, which is that night of 14 December. So now it's become clear that Pakistan's going to surrender. They do something that seems unnecessary. They just rounded up teachers, professors, doctors, and murdered them. Yeah. So December 14th is like an intellectual remembrance day. So I'm going to also look at the identities of who was murdered that day and what that has to do with the cyclone. And the types of questions we're asking is, are cyclone affected areas voting differently, right? Are in the birthplace, in the list of birthplaces of the freedom fighters, the insurgents, are cyclone affected districts overrepresented in those cases? So are people more likely with the experience of the cyclone to actually take up arms, right? And then the idea here is that, some people, so the Pakistan military had to make a list of who to murder on 14 December, right? So you could imagine that, some people became more politically active and attracted their attention, right? So are people hailing from those cyclone affected districts, are they overrepresented in this list? Now, those are the questions we're gonna ask. Now, in terms of the historical literature, there's lots of important people present at the time who suggest that the cyclone did have an effect. So the chief USAID relief officer stationed in East Pakistan, Eric Griffel, actually writes or says to Gary Bass, who's written a wonderful book called The Blood Telegrams, after Nixon's papers were released. So the blood telegram refers to the fact that Archer Blood was the consul general in Dhaka in East Pakistan, who was writing back to Nixon and Kissinger that horrible atrocities are happening. But Nixon and Kissinger, because of their alignment with Pakistan, decided to continue supporting Pakistan. And they had actually, the other thing that was relevant here is that Yahya Khan, who was the military leader of Pakistan at the time, so he was the only one who had a direct line of communication both with Nixon as well as with Mao Zedong, right? So they asked him to play this role of trying to open up trying to open up US-China relations, right? This is right before like ping pong diplomacy, etc. So Yahya Khan was very, very distracted with that role. In fact, after the cyclone hit, instead of coming to Dhaka, he actually went to Peking in order to talk to Mao Zedong. And I'll tell you more about that. And then, okay, so this is a little bit too cute in the sense that Marty Chen was married to somebody, American doctor who was stationed at ICDDRB, International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research in Dhaka at the time. And so she and her friend organized a relief effort. So government wasn't doing anything. They're the ones who organized the relief effort. And so her friend Candy Road wrote a book called The Catalyst, which actually talks about a lot of the stories I'm telling you. But I gave this talk at the Harvard South Asia Study Center, and they invited her to discuss, right? So this was part of our discussion. So she also believes, like from her presence there, that the cyclone and the government's lack of relief did have a lot to do with this. Yeah.
So related to that, I was going to ask about the relief. As it happens, just read the Fazal Abed biography, which links a lot, tries to make the link between the cyclone and the birth of Brack. And I wonder if there's sort of regional variation in that, or
yes. I'll have data on that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So and actually Marty and Kennedy used Abed's living room to store the relief supplies because Abed was working as an accountant in Chittagong for a tobacco company, and they just used it. They weren't getting any support from the government. So, and that was kind
so
of
your data is also going to have the non-government actors who were.
No, not the data. Let's get there. Sure. Yeah. Now there are lots of people who believe the cyclone had a really important effect on the events that happened afterwards in terms of, but there are others like Rehman Soban is the economist who was the architect of the 6-point movement, and he believes that no, the cyclone merely dramatized the argument and reaffirmed a conviction that already existed, that separatist conviction, right? So these are slightly different interpretations of what was happening, right? And then this is a South Asia Studies paper that also ultimately concludes that it was the pre-existing grievances that really mattered, right? So we'll try and, I'm going to show you lots of results that maybe helps us learn something about these competing narratives. Okay, all right, so now on the data. So we got really lucky. So the antecedents to the National Hurricane Center in the US, right? During the Cold War, they put up in January 1970, the first satellite with a geosynchronous orbit, so it could take continuous pictures, okay? And we got really lucky because on November 16th of 1970, the tape recorder malfunctions and the satellite's basically out of commission, but it covers the critical period of the Bhola cyclone, so it captured those pictures. So we have all those pictures, and in 2023, some atmospheric scientists came up with and validated a method for inferring cyclone intensity from those pictures. And the basic idea is that if you have really bad, really strong cloud cover, that prevents solar radiation from reaching the ground, which is something that the satellite measures. All right, so what they show in this paper is that by looking at variation in radiation, you can indirectly infer cloud cover and therefore make an inference about cyclone intensity. So that's the measure we're going to use, but we also have data from, and so it's going to create a measure of cyclone intensity that varies across sub-districts. Like we have it for the entire country, okay? And importantly, we have some weather stations in some places, right? So we can then validate this metric that this indirect inference that we're doing, and it correlates pretty well with ground truth sort of wind speed data. Okay? But of course, we're going to use this just because the data is much more complete. And then afterwards, so this cyclone caused the point estimate would be about 350,000 deaths. Okay? And a lot of the deaths happened not from drowning during the storm, but afterwards, because relief wasn't being provided, there were cholera outbreaks, right? And Candy and Marty described rivers of bodies, like when they went there, the stench was so overwhelming, not just like death and decaying bodies, right? It was difficult to be there. And a famous anecdote from that is, I told you Yahya Khan, the president, was in Peking, and so he stops in Dhaka on the way back, then takes a helicopter ride over just to see the devastation, and he just says it doesn't look too bad, right? And then the relief officers were waiting at the airport, but he gets down and then immediately takes a plane back to Dhaka because some socialite was organizing a party for him. And this was all very, very clear, the government's indifference, their callous response, etc. Okay. Yeah, and then in contrast, the Awami League, which was a separatist party, so that was the Bengali party with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, so they organized some relief activities. And then this is actually from a Pakistani newspaper, like what Yahya Khan partying at the time. And the other thing is that this was all well known, right? It was in major international newspapers that there was immense amount of death and destruction and it required relief. So the contrast here is sometimes American and Soviet helicopters that were providing the relief, whereas Pakistan had a military government which should have been well positioned to organize the relief response. So I'll tell you a quick anecdote. So Candy and Marty, they were young women, American women at the time. So they had gathered like warehouse full of like relief supplies, like blankets, but also rice and oil, etc. So they meet with the Pakistan government officials in Dhaka who asked them to come to the Intercontinental Hotel, and this is in their book. And so these guys, like they agreed to a meeting with them because they wanted to see if they could use the helicopters to transport the goods from Dhaka to the south of the country. And what they report and what they write in the book is that they just close the door and turn on music and start dancing. So they thought they were going to party with two American women. Okay, and then we have a lot of, so there's an economic atlas, economic geography atlas that we've now been able to digitize. So I'll tell you, we have a lot of like control variables here as well. And there's also census from the 1950s that we can use to look at sort of district level demographic composition of the population. Okay. And then the relief distribution data that comes from two World Bank reports we digitized. So one was in 1970, one was in 1972, that just has a list of where relief was provided. And the Pakistan government only provide, so this is Bhola, that the cyclone is named after. They only provided relief in a small subset of areas, right? So in our regression, we'll study to understand the mechanisms, the effect of being cyclone affected, getting relief, the effect of being cyclone affected and not getting relief. So I'm gonna basically in our regression study these two things that I call the two critical steps for successful secession. So first is, does exposure to the cyclone predict voting for the separatist party, right? And here we get lucky because Awami League is clearly identified with a desire for autonomy. So we can just look at the Awami League vote share in each of the constituencies, which maps to the districts. Okay? And second, we'll ask the question, does cyclone exposure affect participation in the guerrilla warfare a few months later? So this happens 4 weeks after the storm, and this happens about 4 months after the storm.
Sorry, just to clarify, that's state relief.
This is, yes, state relief, exactly.
Is there any
We don't-
estimates of what share it is? I mean, there was international relief as well.
Yeah, there was international relief as well, but we don't have, so actually the World Bank reports may allow us to distinguish that. I'll have to take a look. But we focused on just state relief because we were focused on the mechanism or people upset at the incumbent government. Okay. So we've gone to this, so let me just now show you the data. So basically, we've talked about the right-hand side variable. The left-hand side variable comes from Electoral Commission reports and digitizing that. And then this is a really important source of data, which is this list of insurgents. So this is really, this is a pretty serious list. And the reason is we have a Ministry of Liberation War Affairs, and the descendants of the freedom fighters still get government benefits. And to get on this list, you did have to show like 33 different types of documentation. So some of the lists come from India, like who was taken across the border and actually trained in guerrilla warfare, right? And you need to, to get on the list after the fact, you needed witness testimonies, etc. Yeah.
Just to clarify, had the Awami League committed itself to full independence at the time of the election, or was it just, okay, still on the sort of separate?
Just autonomy. So we wanted some political, military, we wanted separate military, separate currencies. Yeah. Yeah, the December 1970 election, if it just followed the democratic process, Awami League would have formed the government. Okay, and then we'll have a lot of control variables on the religious. So for example, it's really important to control for the Hindu share of the population, right? Because of the religious identity of Pakistan. Okay, all right, so basically that creates sort of spatial variation in Awami League vote shares, right? And then from these lists where, we basically know the exact birthplace of the freedom fighters, right? And there are like about 158,000 of them. And that gives, and based on the birthplaces, we can look at spatial variation and exactly where the freedom fighters come from. Okay, and then this is the martyred intellectuals I was talking about on December 14th, right? Here, I am much less confident about the quality of my data. And the reason is, unlike a government officially sanctioned list, right? This is a list that we are having to assemble by ourselves, right? So it's going to be incomplete for sure. And then we're going to correlate that with the storm intensity. Yeah. So essentially, I'm going to show you a bunch of regressions where I'll vary what we control for. And thanks to the dynamic bias we just learned about, we're going to also control for in one of our specifications. I just added this 30 minutes ago. We're going to control for 1954 vote shares for that, because the Awami League emerged around that time. And and they led a coalition called the United Front, right? So that will have this kind of YT as a function of YT minus one.
Mushfiq, can you go back a slide? So that looks super spatially correlated. Like, what do you do with that?
Yeah. So there's two things. I'm going to show you.
Like the South.
Yeah, exactly. So this is unlike, say, bombs going off in various places, right? Yeah. So let me show you all the. So of course, there's two separate issues there. So one is spatial correlation. That's going to be a standard error issue. So we need to deal with that. But then there's also the issue of, you could just get unlucky, and there's like some political geography also follows that same pattern, right? So we'll do a bunch of things. Yeah, let me actually spend my time just like talking about that. Okay, so yeah, so okay, so in order to just spend my time talking about what Ben's asking about, which I think is the critical issue here, let me just quickly say that we find, the main results are quite robust. What we find is that one standard deviation increase in cyclone intensity, as measured from the satellite, right, leads to the Awami League vote share moving from about 73% to about 77%. Okay? So that's the effect on the voting. Okay? The Awami League was going to win the election anyway, right? So the control group thing matters here as well about whether this was pivotal or not. Okay, that's number one. Number two, one standard deviation increase in cyclone intensity leads to an extra 300 insurgents from that district. Okay? So basically what we estimate is because of a one standard deviation increase in cyclone intensity, this had led to 45,000 additional people taking up arms. Okay, so those are going to be our central estimates. Okay, and we also see an effect on the martyred intellectuals, right? But there, again, like these results are going to be quite consistent across different types of many different types of checks. The martyred intellectual result is a lot more sensitive. Okay? So let me just finally say what it is that we're going to do to address that concern. Okay. So the first thing, of course, is we can do balance checks because we have a lot of pre-intervention data. Okay. So for example, I mean, gives you one element of the balance check. The cyclone intensity does not predict in a placebo 1954 voting variation for the exact same party, right? It only predicts for 1970. Okay? We can, and also whether the cyclone is actually, I mean, the satellite is actually picking the effect of the cyclone. If you were to do the same inference and look at cloud cover just one day before the cyclone hits, that's also not predictive of oceans. Okay. So then another issue is that, maybe this is just cyclone prone areas, right? And so luckily or unluckily, we have lots of cyclones happening in southern Bangladesh. So what you can do is do placebos where you look at the subsequent cyclones that have happened, and they do not predict either the vultures or insurgency participation as they should not. Okay. And then another issue that we've worried about is, thanks to Claire's work, we know that coastal areas, and the cyclone is of course correlated with being coastal because that's where the storm came from, right? We know that coastal areas can have different political economic characteristics. Okay, so because Bangladesh is a low-lying delta, right? And the cyclone was large, it did hit non-coastal areas as well. So we can rerun our regression omitting the coastal districts altogether, and the variation in the non-coastal areas is also predictive of voting changes as well as insurgency participation. And then we do a bunch of, and then there's a separate standard errors issue, right? So thankfully, Conley gives us a lot of strategies to do that. There's actually two different, so we try many different bandwidths for Conley standard errors. And we also try this new method, which is basically looking at, if you look at all of the other observables we have, right, that is going to be informative about the spatial correlation in this context, right? And that's another adjustment that we do. So the results are strong enough and clear enough that, of course, they get weaker after some of these adjustments because of what Ben noticed in the map, but they still retain significance. These are the p-values for that.
The sort of cynical question is so one reason there might be more people willing to join this insurgency is because suddenly they have no jobs, and like maybe the Awami League was paying people to like come join the revolution, and you'll get paid. So is it that, or is it that no, I'm actually angry at the government?
Yeah. Okay. So what I did not show you, because we're basically out of time, is that the effect of a one standard deviation in storm intensity when you provide, if you do not provide aid, is moving towards the Awami League. When you do provide aid, it's actually moving away from the Awami League. Okay, and that's true for. Okay, and then one other thing I'll tell you is that in 1954, like we have a baseline measure of how much separatist sentiments there were. So if you're from an area that had more pre-existing grievance, the marginal effect of the cyclone is much larger. There's this interaction effect between the two. Yeah.
Okay, so I think this is a wonderful, fantastic paper, and I absolutely love it. I'd like to make 2 points. One is about what I think is the Mobarak theory of global change, and a second is a set of tests that you could run, which is probably a whole other paper. So I was thinking, so Daron has a really nice paper called Successful Democracies gain their own support, deliver their own support, or something like that. And it's like when a democracy fails to deliver public goods or economic growth, people get unhappy. So this is like a really nice example of when you don't do things, you lose legitimacy. But I was thinking your brilliant point on showing how it depends on pre-existing grievances contrasts really nicely with your earlier paper, where you look at 2 sides of the river, both get hit with extra flooding, but because one is protected, one side sees like much higher livelihoods. and you find that has no effect on women's autonomy or welfare. They still end up child marriage, arranged marriage. And I think this is a really nice example whereby here you have an economic shock and pre-existing coordinated grievances, and then you get national mobilization. But the other case, where you get a shock and women are coordinated and you don't have a criticism of gerontocratic patriarchy, then it all just continues. So the fact that you have pre-existing coordination or grievances really matters. Okay, here's a second idea, a little idea. So in 1971.
All right, Alice, let's talk about your second idea for, sorry that we took too much time.
No, I was just wondering, saying you could discuss this more extensively on live. It's
Let's do the second idea.
Okay, so 1971, the Pakistani army raided.
We're way over time. Can you talk about it at lunch?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. So just to conclude, all I'm saying is that this cyclone sort of gave a unified voice to a lot of disparate grievances, and that converted into a separatist movement that was successful. Thank you.
all right. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll have lunch and adjourn around.